Can I welcome members, officers and the public here in the back of the room or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Please can I ask everybody to make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence, but Assembly Member Duval will be shortly joining us remotely.
Excellent. We look forward to seeing him. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No, jolly good. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. And so we now move on to our main item of business, which is a discussion on the 22-23 GLA group budgets for police and fire. I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests this morning from Mopac, the Metropolitan Police Service, and of course the GLA. So Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Amana Humayo, Chief Finance Officer of Mopac, Ian Percival, Finance Director of the MPS, Robin Wilkinson, Chief of Corporate Services MPS, and Enver, Assistant Director, Group Finance and Performance from the GLA. Welcome all. I'm going to start the questioning today. I'll start with you, Sophie, if I may. Why have you based this budget submission on the assumption that the Met will receive 41% of the government's allocation of additional police officers across England and Wales for the 22 and 23 years?
Sure. What's the etiquette with the masks? Can I just check? Do I take it off?
You can all I think you're pretty...
Is that okay?
Yes, no, please do.
Okay.
If not, it's so muffled and uncomfortable.
No, that's true, it is, yeah. Thank you. So this budget proposal is based on the assumption that we would, the aspiration that we get the 6,000 officers for London that the Commissioner, because of her professional judgment, believes that London should be getting. We have not made any assumptions around how much money we will get from the government for an additional uplift, because we have no way of knowing that yet. We haven't yet had the police settlement. As with previous years, we have assumed the number of officers in the budget proposal that we wished for and we would like to be getting in London. If that doesn't transpire, of course, in the budget in February, we will adjust as we have done in previous years. The Mayor supports the Commissioner in her aspiration for 6,000 additional officers out of the 20,000 officers of government growth, and that's why we have based this budget proposal on the 6,000 officers. So we haven't. It's very difficult to assume the amount of money that we will get from the government, because if you look back over the last two previous years, the first allocation of officers we got was about 1,300. We got £159 million. We got very roughly the same amount in the second year, but we got it was £94 million. So there isn't even, we don't, of the 2 years of police officer uplift growth, there's been two very different allocations. So we haven't made any assumptions about additional growth in the budget.
But it's one hell of an assumption, isn't it? I mean, just because you want 6,000 police officers certainly doesn't mean you're going to get them. And it is 41% of the government's allocation. So it's almost certain that you won't. It's just a figure that's been plucked out. I mean, you should see my Christmas list. I know full well I'm not going to get most of it. But, you write it all down, send it off to Santa and hope for the best. But I mean, this is a whole budget is based on...
I'm very surprised to hear you talking about the Commissioner's professional judgment as a Christmas wish list. This is a professional judgment of the Commissioner, what London needs operationally and what she needs operationally to keep London safe. So you can make comments like that.
We're talking about a budget that is based on quite an absurd wish to receive 41% of those officers.
The aspiration and the figure of 6,000 officers for London is based on the professional judgment of the Commissioner. I take the professional judgment of the Commissioner of what London needs operationally and what she needs for the Metropolitan Police to keep London safe. I take that very seriously, and that's why this budget is based on that.
Well, I think we should be basing budgets on facts, or at least achievable aspirations, as opposed to what you've done here. I mean, in order to meet the Met's target of 6,000 additional... Yes. I think it's...
I can't hear, sorry, I can't hear what was said.
Sorry, just asking for clarification. The national stage for government is 20,000 and 6,000 represent 30% of 44%.
It's the additional officers that are still to be allocated. It's the additional officers
It's not 40%. You're right. It's not 40%. It's I think it's about 33%, isn't it? I can give you that figure. Yeah. Of the 20.
So 3,200 of the 8,000.
Apologies, everybody. We had a technical glitch there, but it looks like we're back in action. So going back to Sophie, you concede in your own budget submission that the spending review does not... Apologies, still the gremlins are there. I'll start again. Sophie, you concede in your own budget submission that the spending review does not confirm whether the Met's request for 3,287 additional officers will be met, and that the analysis for the headline figures suggests that it will not be met. Why have you based your budget submission on an assumption that your own analysis concedes is not realistic?
I don't accept your analysis of our proposal and what we have been saying. We, as we've just previously been discussing, we've set this budget submission on the professional judgment of the Commissioner that 6,000 officers are needed. In order for her to not have to make the most difficult decisions, there will still be compromises made. But in terms of operationally, this is of the 20,000, and it's based on the 20,000. She believes that London, to get its share, should get 6,000, and that is what we've based the budget on. What you've been saying about the percentage or proportion of the 20,000 we will need to, the 8,000 that are left to be allocated that we'll need to get for next year. My challenge back to that is that's not the issue about what London needs. The issue is about how many extra officers are actually going to be funded. We are in the position that we want the best for London. We want the Metropolitan Police to have the officers they need to keep London safe. 6,000 is what the Commissioner believes is necessary out of the allocation there is at the moment.
Yes, and we'd all love London to have... That's actually not in question whatsoever. This is about a budget that is based on a submission on an assumption that your own analysis concedes is not realistic. This isn't about whether we should or shouldn't have 6,000 police officers. You know me, I'd love 12,000. That's not the point. We are looking at a budget, and your budget submission is on based on an assumption that your own analysis concedes is not realistic. Should you be basing a budget on figures that you know are not realistic? Is that sensible?
We've based this budget on the way we've built this budget in the way we've built the last few budgets, and the same of what we want and the proposals that we need for the number of officers. We have not made assumptions about additional growth. Which figure would you want us to pick that we should assume in this budget? The 159 or the 159 million pounds that we got in the first year, or the 94 million pounds that we got in the second year? We have no way of knowing what assumptions to make, so we have made no assumptions. In the final budget, as you know, of course, once we've got the police settlement, we will balance the budget properly. We will have the figures that we know about the allocation and we know we're getting, and we will continue from there. This budget is based on, is the way we have done previous budgets and budget proposals. There's nothing different.
You've based this on a wish that you know is not going to materialise in its extent. If the MPS were given the funding for it's going to be one of those days. If the MPS were given the funding for 3,287 additional officers this year, could you actually recruit, train and deploy that many within the year? The committee has previously been told that there is a limit on numbers in that respect.
I mean, Robin will probably want to come in here, but yes, it will be challenging. It may be challenging because of the labour market. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID and the economy, but it will be challenging. But we would, we'd do our best to do that. Robin, did you want to come in?
No, I mean, of course it would be challenging, but it would be a challenge we would step into as best we can, Chair. The Commissioner's clear that London needs the highest operational establishment that he can get. As you know, we are also continuing to talk to government about the National International Capital City grant funding, for which we are over £100 million short against what the Home Office accepted that we needed. And so we will continue to press government for the strongest possible allocation for London. And we've got a training capacity that has accelerated, and we've shown that we can push even further. Of course, it would be challenging through the year to meet the high number, but if that's what it was, we're a large organisation, and we would do our very, very best to step forward into that.
I've no doubt you'd do your best. I'm questioning whether you'd be capable of doing that, or whether you even think you would. What is the largest year-on-year increase in police numbers the MPS has ever seen over the last decade?
I think, Chair, that we have grown. We've recruited over 4,000 in a year previously.
In the year previously?
In a year previously, I believe. I mean, I can write to confirm, Chair, if that's happy, but I believe in an earlier period of growth, we recruited about 4,000 police officers. I'm not saying we grew by 4,000, but a combination of taking backfilling retirements, exits, and growing the organisation. I think we have managed to recruit and train 4,000 in a year.
Well, that's interesting, because we did some research on it and we couldn't find anything higher than 1,767.
No, I think,
and
Chair,
that was between March 19 and March 2020.
I think, Chair, that will be if I may, possibly the growth in overall numbers. Of course, our training capacity has to backfill exits, retirements, and stuff like that. Of
course, which is about 1,000 a year, isn't it?
About that. It's slightly lower at the moment.
Well, that's good news in itself, but nevertheless, it peters around there, doesn't it? I'm just saying that even if you could realise the amounts that you want, I don't think you'd be able to, and I don't think you'd think you'd be able to actually recruit and get them all in, and still accommodate the fact that you will still lose staff during the year, because that adds around another 1,000 to it. So, I mean, you've really based the budget around police officers on a desire as opposed to a realistic expectation. You did the same last year, you've mentioned that, and so there's a gap. And so the Mayor can point to these figures at the government and say, you've got to give me more, this is what we want, etc., etc. But this is a budget. I do not understand why you haven't been far more realistic when you're actually budgeting. This is where you cause problems.
If I may, I think the budget proposal is very, very clear as to what is the gap because of police officer numbers and the fact that we haven't assumed an additional allocation, and what is the gap, a structural gap. We're absolutely clear about that. There's the gap if, the financial gap for police officer numbers was £187 million, and the structural gap is £62 million. We have been really transparent and open in the budget proposal as to what is police officers and what is the structural gap. We are still, even without the issue that we seem to be going round and round on at the moment, even without that issue around should we or shouldn't we have not have assumed 6,000 officers, the Metropolitan Police is facing a structural gap of £62 million. Those are savings that have to be found between now and February. So I think we've been really open, transparent about what we have done. We're not inflating figures. We've been transparent about it. We have two different gaps here, police officer numbers and a structural gap. And I think £62 million next year, even if we get the adequate amount of funding for police officers and a reduced number, that's a significant amount of money that needs to be saved just in the next financial year. Clearly, as you'll see from the proposal, that grows and grows in the following years.
Yes, we're coming on to things like that. I'll call you in a minute, Assembly Member Sahota. What would be the financial impact on this budget of assuming a lower level of additional officers? What sort of impact would that have?
Well, it would reduce when we set the final budget, it will, the gap, that non-structural gap about police officer pay, that depending on what we get in, we will adjust. And they won't. I mean, Mana might want to come in terms of other budget lines, but we will set a balanced budget. We will not have that structural gap.
Do you want to comment on that, Amana?
So Sophie's right. So as she said, our total budget gap is almost 250 million. The large proportion of that is non-structural, and that's based on the total allocation of the 6,000. Depending on what the final settlement tells us, hopefully next week, we will then be in a position to propose a final budget based on the actual number of officers that we think we'll get. But as Sophie's already mentioned, it's difficult to just randomly pick a number because our year 1 and year 2 allocations have been so different. We don't know what our year 3 allocation is going to be. The one consistent point is that both the Commissioner and the Mayor have always used 6,000, and that's why we've stuck with that.
And I know the Mayor has. Government have never confirmed that at all. What would be do you think that if the assumption was lower, would that reduce the 62 million at all? Not at all.
There would be a marginal impact because within the 62 million is included the impact of the additional national insurance contributions.
Yeah.
So as you know, the government has increased the health and social care levy by 1.25%. The total gap that's created is about 17 million. That entire 17 million is within the structural component of 62. So within that 62 million is 17 million, and that includes the NI contribution for the total 6,000. So there would be a marginal impact.
So it will make some impact. Okay, well, we'll see clearly when the next lot of your budget comes through. Thank you for that, Marla. Going back to Sophie, what are the financial implications of the new police and crime plan on the budget?
We're out to consultation on the police and crime plan, and we are, most of what is in the police and crime plan will be costed. The question for me in taking forward a delivery of the police and crime plan is the amount of funding that we get from the government in relation to Home Office grants around the Violence Reduction Unit, amount of funding we get in relation to victim services and other funding. We get really good, we have had some very good I was going to say wins, but I don't like it. Sounds so sort of crass about it. But we've had some very good applications for money to the government accepted, and that has meant that we've boosted the amount of work that we can do. So the police and crime plan, we will deliver all of it. The question for me is what scale, the scalability of the police and crime plan, depending on government grant, government funding, but also dependent on what the final financial settlement is for the whole of the GLA. I mean, the Mayor published the GLA budget last year with was it a decrease of £38 million within the budget because of the impact of COVID. So what the impact on the police and crime plan will be is scalability, how far and how much we can do, but we will deliver, once we've consulted and finalised the police and crime plan, we will deliver all of it.
And how much actual flexibility is there within the budget to adjust it in line with the priorities and directions of the final police and crime plan?
So some of that will depend on grants and income from the government. So, for example, victim services, we do not yet know the figure that we'll get from the government on victim services. So some of that's dependent on that. Also dependent on what we will do with some of the reserves that we've got. And those reserves, I'm already using some reserves and have taken decisions to use some reserves in order to bridge the gap that we've got at the moment, bridge them over this period of time from the proposal of the budget to the finalising of the budget, because the way that, as you know, the way that services work, if we don't give them some certainty from next financial year, staff will start to leave. So we've given them some certainty, a 6-month period of certainty using reserves. So the question for me is how much more, and we will make decisions about that in the coming months about how much more of the use of reserves we should be putting into not just bridging gaps, but also delivering the police and crime plan.
Okay, we'll probably come back to that. I'm going to go back to the additional police officers and bring in Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you. Is my mic working? Yes. I'd just like to come back to this question about not making an assumption. So if I appreciate I'm new. I'm just checking the figures here. So you've assumed 3,287 officers and £0 of funding from the government for those officers. Is that the assumption that's in your budget?
We haven't assumed any additional growth of money in the budget.
So you've assumed that the government will give you 3,287 officers and it will give you no money.
No.
So how
We're
much
saying
money
we
have you
don't know what-
assumed?
We're saying we don't know what that figure will be, so we haven't put a figure in
So-
until when we get the police settlement, and if it's next week, we will know the figure. It will then go into the budget, and we'll set the final budget. This is a draft proposed budget based on the figures that we have at the moment.
I mean, that is a figure of zero then. If there's no figure in there, the figure is zero. And it just seems to me, you're calling it no assumption, but it looks like an assumption that allows the mayor to say that we're woefully underfunded. So you've got this figure of 62,000, which is the structural gap that you're looking at. By assuming that you'll get a very large number of officers, which Assemblymember Hall was suggesting earlier might be unrealistic, and also that you're going to get zero money for those extra officers, what it allows the mayor to do is to quadruple the size of the budget gap and then do another round of scaremongering in the media. Is that what, I mean, that's what this assumption looks like. Is that not what you've assumed?
However many different ways you answer the question, the answer is going to be the same. We have done what we have, this budget is built in the way that we built the last couple of budgets, on the the professional judgment of the Commissioner that out of the 20,000 additional officers, London should get 6,000. That is the assumption we've made. However many different ways you ask the question, you're going to get the same answer. I do think we're going round in circles.
Well, is it the professional judgment of the Commissioner that the government will give us £0 for 3,000 officers?
As I've said, we have
Because
not
that's the figure in the budget.
But which figure would you like us to pick in terms of and put into this budget? Do you want us to put in the first allocation, which is 159 million, or the second allocation, which is 94 million? We don't know what we're going to get, so we've not assumed it. I actually think that's really prudent financial. Having been a councillor myself and a councillor in Hackney, where Hackney got into terrible, terrible trouble because it used to assume money that it hadn't got.
Okay,
And,
you've assumed police officers that you haven't got. So what you could do is you could have made a conservative assumption of the lower of the two figures, or you could have taken an average of the two figures, and you could have made it clear that that was a planning number that would be subject to change when there's a confirmation. But I don't see that it's to quote you, no assumption, to assume that you're going to get a very large allocation of officers that, as Assemblymember Hall explored, seems unlikely, and that alongside that there will be zero additional funding from the government. It just seems to me calculated to quadruple the gap in order to create a period where you can claim that you're woefully underfunded. We have a funding problem of 62 million, but this extra 187 is an imaginary gap based on an assumption that you'll get a very large number of officers and an assumption that you'll get no money, has that ever happened? Have we ever had extra officers and no extra money?
But that is why we're really clear in the budget, and we've not we've not put in, just given one overall figure around what the gap is. We've been absolutely clear in the proposal that there's the structural gap of £62 million and the non-structural gap. And as with the process of the budget setting, by February, well, hopefully by next week, we will know what the money is that we are getting, and it will go into the budget. That is the way the budget's been built in the last couple of years, and that's the way we built the budget. I don't think that it is clear, it's transparent, it's accountable, and that's the way, that's the way we have built this budget, and the Met built the budget as well.
So anyone quoting that sort of headline figure of 200 and something million, that's an inaccurate figure, isn't it?
The figure, I mean, it's very clear from the budget proposal how the figure has been got to. And again, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. I mean,
I feel like you're not saying the same thing.
I am. I'm saying that we've been
Perhaps I'll
incredibly
leave it
clear.
there, Chair.
There's a
I'm aware
structural
that
gap and a non-structural
time is-
gap, police officers, and then there's the structural gap.
Okay, well, I look forward to the when will we know what the actual numbers are on the number of officers and then the number of pounds that we're getting for those officers?
When the government announces its police settlement, we don't know when that will be. We think it might be next week. We're hoping it's next week, so it's not actually the week of Christmas, but we don't know. It has actually slipped into January before.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Sahota, you indicated, did you want to come under that? Because I then got Assemblymember Duval that wants to come in after. Okay.
Sophie, I know that Christmas parties must be on the mind of the Tory members here, and that's probably why the parallel with Santa Claus's wish list has been drawn to the 6,000 figure. But can you agree with me that the Assembly did pass a motion unanimously supporting the Mayor and the Commissioner's call for 6,000 extra police officers? And why does London need these 6,000 officers?
I had actually, yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, previously we have had support for the 6,000. I mean, I'd probably pass over to the Met, Robin himself and the Met around why London needs the officers. It is the professional judgment of the Commissioner around not having to make difficult choices, the most difficult choices in keeping London safe. Complexity of crime is increasing. We've still have, despite some really good underlying figures around violence, we still have a real issue around tackling violence, and the Mayor is making a keynote speech today around what we're doing about tackling the drivers of crime. And then we also have the fact that London is a capital city. We are, under the Metropolitan Police is under massive pressure in policing London as an international capital city. I don't know if you want to add anything, Robin.
Just to reinforce, I mean, the Commissioner, I know, has welcomed the support from many in London for growth from government, and to be clear, the Commissioner, the Met, fantastically supports the 20,000 uplift for government, and as you'll have seen from our spending review submission, we have said, and the Commissioner has said to government, we would encourage you to go further. We would encourage you to put another 10,000 officers in, for which the Met would then get an allocation. We have to make, the Commissioner has to make tough choices, and officers have to make tough choices every day on which crimes we are able to investigate and which crimes we are unable to investigate. Our officers are working extended hours. We've got substantial numbers of cancelled rest days, and that just reflects, if I may, the dedication of officers in putting themselves onto the front line and say working extended hours. There's pressure in the system, and that's why the Commissioner is saying she thinks a fair allocation would be 6,000. I think one more thing, if I just may if we look at the impact of where we have allocated officers from the first year of growth dedicated to violence reduction. We were very clear, the Commissioner was very clear that was the priority, and the performance impact that's been had across London, fantastic results in reducing robbery, reducing knife crime. That shows the value and the need for additional officers in London in order to confront the issues that this committee and the GLA and others are rightly saying the Met needs to tackle.
So we all agreed that we need 6,000 more police officers. So the debate is about what number should be used in this budget. And if we put any other number but that 6,000, would it not be signalling to the government and to other people that we could cope with less number? It would be an admission by the Assembly and by the Mayor that we could cope with less numbers. So putting any other figure would be misleading and would be betrayal to the resolutions and the motions and needs of London. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, absolutely. And it's we've had the support of the Assembly, and we have the support of Londoners on this as well.
Thank you.
Right. Can I make it clear, on behalf of everybody, all my colleagues, on all sides of the political parties, the more police officers we have, the happier we all are. There is no question about that. Can I bring my colleagues back to understanding we are talking today about the budget? And if we keep going off on tangents on everything else, we will literally be here all day. There is no question but that we all want 6,000 extra officers or more. But we are looking at the budget. Assembly Member Duval.
I'm not sure about that, Chair, sometimes, because I think sometimes the Conservative colleagues sound like they want to do London down. The 6,000 police officers, my question to the Deputy Mayor, is based on a formula that I understand there are elements to that formula that have never been questioned in terms of allocating police officers. It's only the Conservative government that's changed its mind that thinks Londoners should get less. Is that correct? Is it the basic formula about how we allocate police officers nationally around to the largest organisations, the largest amount of crime, the largest geographical areas, and all the rest? Is that correct in terms of how we've arrived, how the Commissioner has arrived? Remember, this is a professional figure. And I would remind the Conservatives in this meeting, And I'm glad that we have been reminded that it's an Assembly position. This is a working draft budget. Things will change. And of course, if things don't materialise, you change the figures. But at this stage, why would we shortchange Londoners on what is rightly a fair allocation of police officers? We need to deliver a safer London.
Yes, are you going to
So,
try and
yes.
answer? It wasn't a question as such.
No, there was a very clear question on that, which is how was the 6,000 derived, and it is based on formula and then based on the formula of allocations for police officers. Robin?
So the only people that are undermined.
I think they're going to try and answer, Assembly Member
Sorry, I thought they
Duval.
had answered.
Well, it will,
Apologies.
So the government are using the funding formula, which and we're currently reviewing. The government are currently reviewing the funding formula as well, because there is a wide recognition across policing that it's no longer accurately reflecting the demands, both the crime and the non-crime demands. Of course, what the government also have accepted is through the National International Capital City grant that the funding formula doesn't fully reflect the demands of policing in London. So allocating the police officers just by version of the funding formula effectively misses the point that London is different. And if I may, the income, which we've not shown in this budget because we don't know what it will be, we are continuing to push not only for income to enable us to grow officer numbers to the highest level that we possibly can, but we're also, again, saying to government, through this settlement, you have an opportunity to make up the shortfall in the National International Capital City grant funding. If that money were to be provided, then we would, of course, want to increase the size of the front line through that funding too. So there is a dilemma with this allocation, and that's why we've not given up. We've not given up saying to government, we think London deserves more, and I think that's the right thing to do, and it's certainly the Commissioner's strong opinion.
And that deserving more is based on a fair formula and a fair assessments based on what's happened in the past, because the government haven't changed the formula. Is that correct? Because they're changing it by stealth on this. We are being shortchanged in an all number of areas, whether it's from incoming grants or in terms of numbers of police officers. Is that correct?
I think, if I may, Chair, everybody in every police force would argue that the funding formula wasn't quite fair because it didn't give every force enough. The issue is the size of the pie, really, that's allocated rather than the actual allocation itself. The issue we can say is that the National International Capital City work is not fully funded. It's been accepted, reviewed by the Home Office. A gap of over £100 million. That's a couple of thousand extra police officers in itself. That London would be able to recruit, and of course we have to fund the international capital city work. It's the protest activity. It's keeping London safe. We have to fund that. The consequence is we are not funding the rest of London to the level that we would want, and that's why we continue to push hard for the NIC funding to be fully funded, and we hope government will respond this year through this settlement.
Thank you. The grants, we're going on to grants.
Sorry, one final question, really, just to do with these numbers and the way this budget is being presented. So, Chair, I think you raised it. So can I go back to Sophie? The question about this, the way that we've presented this budget, the way Mopac has presented the policing budget, has it caused any detriment to the policing budgets in past years in terms of the assessment of the policing requirement? It's not caused much problem, is it? It is a working draft budget. And I'm not sure why our Conservative colleagues are so uncomfortable when we're highlighting the figures that we need in extra police officers to serve Londoners. Is it correct there has been no detriment to the budget itself in terms of the assessments, the initial assessments you've put forward of what we require to police London, including these extra police officers?
It is absolutely correct. There's no detriment to it whatsoever, and I'd say it is it's a powerful case for London, and that's why it is a budget proposal. And as we all know, that these figures change. They will move. They will move for a number of reasons, not just because of police officer allocations, but when we know what the Home Office is going to give us, when we know what the MOJ is going to give us, and when we know about whether the new health levy is going to be funded and how it's going to be funded. The figures are changing. There has never been any detriment in terms of the way in which this budget has been being put forward.
Right, okay. I think we'll move on to grants now. Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. This question is to Robin. Your budget submission states that the Met has made minor refinements to its cost per officer uplift assumptions for next year. What is the Met cost per officer uplift assumptions for 2022-23?
So what are we assuming is the cost per officer?
Yes, the cost per officer uplift assumptions for next year.
Well, I mean, it's the cost of the gap that we've been talking about divided by the number of officers we've asked for. That's the way in which the gap is created. This the non-structural gap. So it's and our assumptions are aligned with the National Police model that was submitted to the Home Office. I don't know if we've got the figure per officer.
That's 62, isn't it? 62, isn't it?
You might.
So the assumption is just over £50,000 per officer based on the non-structural gap of 187 million.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And the next question is to Enver. What would the impact on the 22-23 budget be if there was a £10 increase in the council tax police precept? What income would that create for us?
In addition to the 1.99% that's already been baked in, it would be another 14.2 million.
14.2 million. Okay. Thank you for that. And to Sophie, would you agree that the government looks set to continue to plan to fund the police through regressive council tax rises rather than police funding settlement? Do you think that might be what's happening?
That's my real worry, that is the direction of travel. It's been the direction of travel for a couple of years, hasn't it? And is to place the burden of funding police officers more on the council taxpayers of whatever force you are in. And actually, London, whilst I think it's wrong, and I do think it's a regressive tax, a regressive way to fund what is a universal provision and an essential universal provision. London, we in some ways it's very difficult for the mayor to make these decisions, but we do get a fair, we get a yield, £14 million. If you're in other parts of the country, you do not get that yield. So it's really difficult for other forces. So across the country, it is a real problem. And you can see it in the figures when you look at how much of the Metropolitan Police budget is accounted for from government. It has been slowly falling in the last couple of years. I think we're on 69% of the Metropolitan Police budget is now government grant, and that has been that's fallen from the mid-70s. I think it was 70% last year. You can just see that sliding down. It's not the right way to fund policing.
Okay. And currently, 1,300 police officers are being funded through reserve investment by the mayor, coming out of the City Hall funding. Now, if the government continues to underfund the police force, what will the consequence of that be for London?
Well, at the moment, there's 1,300 officers that are funded by the mayor. 300 of those are baked into the baseline budget. And 1,000 of them are from you. I'm sure members will remember the mayor transferred business rates and put it into reserve. That is being funded for the rest of the administration. Those 1,000 officers. If the government cut the number of, it's always the same. The biggest cost for the Metropolitan Police is officers and staff. So if you're having to make substantial savings, the way that, especially now after £1 billion worth of savings since 2013, and it's not because for the lack of trying, but actually there comes a point where you cannot get any more savings except from people, and that those are officers and staff.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing, just Robin, I understand that your budget submission was late this year. Was the reason for that?
I think our conversations with Mopac were taking place all the way through and up to. My understanding is that on the day of submission, there was one further issue to work through, which was worked through between the teams in order to get it as right as possible. I think everybody here would apologise to the committee for that, but we did our very, very best to get the material to the committee at the earliest opportunity. It is a challenge, as we've been exploring, having a draft budget submission and this a week before the critical decision, which is when we are told how much money we will actually get for the budget. So it's a difficult process.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just go back on a couple of these? Robin, you said it's about 50k per officer. Do you think you could provide the committee, not now, but put it in writing to us, details of the last 5 years in terms of how you've calculated the cost of additional new officers? That would be useful for us. Thank you. Sophie, the draft budget doesn't currently assume that the Mayor will increase the policing precept, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So what's the Mayor's current thinking on this, whether he's going to increase it or not?
Well, sorry, you're not going to like this answer. We're going to wait and see what the policing funding settlement is, and then the Mayor will take decisions about what we are getting from government and what he can do, and then he'll take those decisions.
Has he ever not increased it?
I think we have increased it every year, which is in order to be able to protect frontline policing, which is obviously, which as we know, is not what the previous incumbent of this post and now Prime Minister did.
Well, we're not talking about the previous Mayor. We're here to look at what this Mayor is doing and what you're doing. So they've never not increased the policing precept, because it can go up to £10 this year, but it's not been put in anything in that respect has put in the budget. So you're accounting for more, or putting in more police officers and not accounting for something you'll probably get. Yeah. Okay, fine. Anybody got any subs on this? Did you want to? No? Okay. That's fine. Let's move on then to the revenue budget, and my colleague, Assembly Member Pigeon, is going to start with these.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So looking at the revenue budget, Robin, should I come to you to start off with? I'm going to put officers to one side. We've been discussing that in great detail, but to what extent are the additional resources proposed in the budget financially sustainable, given that you have as a whole got this £62 million structural budget deficit?
Thank you. This really does depend on the nature of the settlement that we get, obviously, and we will be continue to talk to government about funding and the national insurance, the National International Capital City funding. We will continue to talk to Sophie and the Mayor about the council tax funding and business rates funding, because we're very, very clear. We've got significant savings already built into this budget, which I think it is important, and I hope the committee accept the challenge. Quite rightly, the Met is doing what it can to reduce costs. So built within this budget is an assumption of a 2% year-on-year reduction in our corporate costs, and a assumed 1% a year efficiency savings on all other budgets that are not police officer related. So we're trying really, really hard, and these are challenging efficiency targets. We're going to have to make some tough choices when we get the budget. We are, it is a reasonable assumption, and certainly a hope, that when, as part of the police funding settlement, the government will provide funding for new officers, for us to be able to, I describe it as keeping the Met in shape. The Met is not just police officers. Police officers require custody officers, they require forensics officers, they require finance teams and such like. The bigger the organisation, the more complex it gets, so we need to keep the Met in shape. We might have to make some tough choices about increasing other bits of the Met less in order to be able to meet these funding gaps. We might have to take some tough choices about cutting some service provision, either internally or externally. What we don't want to do is do that preemptively. We've not, for example, as we've done in previous years, put on a recruitment freeze for police staff just in anticipation, because that's highly disruptive and suboptimal performance. So we've got some tough choices to make once we see the shape of the settlement hopefully next week, and once we know the Mayor's decisions around funding from City Hall.
Yes, and it's always rather frustrating, this whole process. It's frustrating for us as members and for you, I'm sure, as well, that, we're trying to look at something, but it's so hypothetical, a lot of it. It's, it really is rather difficult, hence probably some of the questions you've had today. What I'm trying to understand is one of your assumptions is you're putting a 6.8% increase in frontline police to fund 650 new officers in town centres and high streets. Is that assumption only based on if you get additional officers, or is that a reprioritisation or moving of existing officers? So that will happen whether you get the uplift in officers or not.
We're very proud of the movement of the town centre teams. That's part of our current year's growth. So that's as part of the extra resources we got in the current financial year. Now that we've been able to begin to recruit those extra officers, we are adding capacity into town centre teams to tackle violence and to make those areas safer for everybody, including to tackle violence against women and girls. So that's a decision this year, and we are committed. One of the rules of the police uplift programme is that we have to sustain that police officer baseline. So in that respect, that's guaranteed, because police officer numbers will need to stay at that level. What it means is if we have choice to make, if we have gaps to make, then it has to come out of the non-police officer areas of the budget, police staff and other areas of spend. And that's where we have been focusing. That's where the efficiency savings that we're already committed to make are coming out. I'm sure we'll get onto our estate, but that's why we've got the estate strategy that we've got. That's where our focus is going to be. The other big unknown, if I may, is obviously the cost of pay.
That's was exactly my next question, is that you've got a 2% assumption, haven't you?
We have.
Around officer and staff pay. Are you comfortable with that? What's that based on?
So this is very, very, this is tough. This is going to be another of the very, very big variables. We won't know what the pay award is going to be until probably May or June next year. And this is such a big part of our budget. We are worried, increasingly worried about the 2%. The 2%, we increased our assumptions a couple of months ago from 1% to 2%, recognising where inflation was moving and in response to the changes in the national insurance contributions. But with inflation now forecast to be possibly as much as 5% in the spring of next year, recognising that officers who have worked tirelessly through the pandemic and received no pay increase this year compared to other public workers. We are very, very concerned about the impact on what the disposable income of our officers, their morale, motivation, if we're unable to afford a suitable pay rise. We've got some really, really difficult decisions as a management board, and then in discussions with Sophie and the Mayor over the next 4 to 6 weeks before we submit our evidence to the pay review body about whether or not about how we can make a pay award affordable. I would not, as I sit here today, at all suggest that 2% would be the right pay award for hard-working police officers next year. So this will have a very significant stretch impact on the budget.
Okay, and in terms of prioritising where you're spending, we've talked about the town centre officers, and that's guaranteed. It's not reliant on the extra officers. You've moved resource or put additional resource there. How have you gone about as the Met Police to prioritise your spending? Because obviously you are operationally independent, as Cressida rightly reminded us last week. But how do you prioritise? And what influence does the Mayor's manifesto and his priorities have on that?
So we're guided by three things, really. One, obviously, the operational independence of the Commissioner and her and our professional judgment about what London needs in order to tackle competing demands. But strategically, we have our strategy, Met Direction. We're very clear. We think it is a good framework to enable us to balance what will always be limited resources. We could always do more. And we have the police and crime plan, the old police and crime plan, and now the new police and crime plan. Our belief is that the strategy, or our current strategy, is very well aligned to the police and crime draft police and crime plan that's currently being published. So there is not, I think, there's no significant tension within that of having to realign resources. But as a board, we are constantly looking at how performance. Where have we got crime rising? Where have we got performance impacts? And how we think we can then align new resource and new capacity to have the most impact. So, for example, the commissioner will have talked to the committee many times. I know we decided in year one to invest in predatory offender units, and they've had a significant impact in tracking down wanted offenders. We've invested in the violence suppression units and the VCTF. Because we've seen such a big impact on violence. We know when we add more resource, we have impact, and that's what we expect from the town centre teams. We, of course, as we sit here today, we are looking and thinking about new growth and how we can particularly increase detections, and that's one of our priorities as a board. It's one of the commissioner's priorities going into the next year. What can we do to increase the number of and the proportion of detections? And we'll be making decisions as a board and talking to Sophie and the Mayor about that, but making decisions as a management board and the Commissioner over the course of the next 3 to 4 months on where our year 3 growth will be allocated.
And in terms of what was before us today and hopefully what will be developed, to help with all that you just talked about, digital forensics are really, really important. Obviously, there's a revenue and a capital cost there. And that, there's a huge issue about the length of time you are holding people's phones and devices and so on. I know the Deputy Commissioner told me recently you're rolling out your improved kiosks and all this. What budget is in here for that? Because that will help with your sanction detection rates if you're able to deal with that more speedily.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've, through really, really rigorous prioritisation this year, we've been able to identify and invest an extra £12 million in digital forensics. We announced that a couple of weeks ago. That doesn't deal with all of the issues. It's a necessary investment, and we've done that through rigorous prioritisation. As I think we said to the committee last year, we ran a priority-based budgeting process, and as a result of that, we were able to release money from elsewhere and invest in that priority because, as you say, it's critical for victims and it's critical for success. But we are clear that we will need to. We'll need to find a way of going further in digital forensics. That's probably as far as we can go at this stage in terms of being able to bring new capacity through. But in next year and beyond, I'm pretty certain we're going to need to find ways of increasing that capacity even further.
And is that increase just in sort of new kiosks and so on and training of staff in-house, or is this expanding your contract with your digital forensics supplier?
It'll be a mix. Because we need to keep in balance. This is about extra expert staff,
yes,
as well as us being able to, if you like, industrialise for frontline officers the ability to identify and extract the information they need to do their investigation well, and obviously, as you've said, provide a really the best possible service to victims, because that's what we need to do. We do our utmost to provide phones back to victims at the earliest opportunity. And as you know, we're one of the pilot forces that is providing an alternative phone if we are, for whatever reason, unable to do so. But we're very strongly committed to that.
Great, thank you. Can I move on to Ian now and just ask you, looking at your projections, you're currently projecting a £132 million structural budget gap by 24-25. What are you looking at to balance the budget given that scale?
Well, I think we're looking at, obviously we're looking at a whole host of things, and a lot of it, the first thing will be, to repeat what's been said before, it will depend on where the settlement leaves us. So if once we get the settlement and we have clarity on the number of officers and we have clarity on the level of funding, that will then, obviously, we'll then have a revised baseline. After that, we're then, as Robin said before, we will just have to look at a whole suite of options. We ran a PBB process last year. we can look at doing that. We will look at doing that again to look at our whole
So what's the process?
Sorry, priority-based budgeting process.
Right, okay.
So we did part of that last year, and depending on where the settlement leaves us, we would look to do that again to stretch out for the next 2 to 3 years to look at where we can either reduce or reallocate funding across services.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And finally, Sophie, I obviously push Robin on how the Met have looked to prioritise, but how have you prioritised the additional service you are delivering as part of this budget?
I mean, the prioritisations around the mayor's priorities around tackling violence in all its forms. So that, yes, is around tackling street violence, but violence against women and girls. Looking at, and we have set out in the proposal how, you know, some of the sections, some of the mayoral manifesto commitments are being delivered, and some of the budgeting within that. So you've got Mayor's Action Plan, some of the budget from the Mayor's Action Plan around trust and confidence. Of course, again, it depends. Some of it's dependent on the government grant, but in terms of victim services, making sure that we've got proper allocation of budget for that as well. So we have set that out in the proposal around the mayoral priorities from the manifesto, which obviously feed into the police and crime plan.
Lovely. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to let anybody know, I know some of our offices are contacting us. The broadcast has stopped, but it is still recording, so there will be a transcript of the meeting, just in case anybody is concerned for that. Assembly Member Hirani, you've got some questions. It's been covered. That's good news. Okay, there's just a couple of questions before we come on to Assembly Member Fortune. The draft, this is to Ian, I think, really. The draft budget states that closing the gap will be extremely challenging, which we accept, and specifically refers to the MPS needing more government support. Can you quantify what you believe is needed in both 22 and 23 and future years? What is a realistic figure?
So I've understood the question. I mean, the realistic figure that we've shown, obviously we have the two gaps. We have the structural and the non-structural. And in order for us to obviously balance the budget, then it's the non-structural gap, as well as the PUP funding, the uplift funding. We need to cover the non-structural gap either with additional funding or with alternative savings. Okay,
So it's that figure. What was it? 62 million.
Mm-hmm.
Chair, if I may can I just add the other, as I said, in response to Assemblymember Pigeon, depending on where we are with where pay is and where the pay review body, government sits on pay, we will have to have further conversations with government around the affordability of a decent and appropriate pay award for government, and I wouldn't want us to ignore that and miss that opportunity. You know, that is, the government are saying at the moment that they expect the settlements to cover the increasing costs, inflation, pay, the increase in the national insurance contributions. We'll wait and see what comes through. £550 million for policing is, of course, a big amount. But a 1% pay award in the Met, an extra 1% adds an extra £25 million to our cost base. And if we've got inflation at those kind of levels, it's going to have an impact that we will need to engage with government on.
I was just wondering what a figure was, because all I ever hear, which is, especially from some colleagues, is more. I just wondered what more looked like. So you've articulated some of that. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to Assemblymember Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sophie, this one's for you. It just goes back to that police funding formula review that we've talked about already. Could you just tell the committee a little bit about some of the representations you've made to government about that?
The government have just kicked off the police funding formula review, and we will be making representations about that. Robin sits on, I can't remember what the board is called, but one of the boards that the government has put together, and Amana, through the APCC and our own interactions with the government, will be making representations. I have to say it's really opaque at the moment. It's very difficult. We don't know what they're doing. They have appointed a professor to lead the funding formula review. And it is always a worry for London, a funding formula review, because, as Robin said, it's really about the size of the pie. And outside of London, any redistribution of resources to else will affect London, and it is always a worry. The last time we did feed in a lot of the London statistics and the complexity of London, and I think that made it, clear that they could not, they could not change the funding formula review so it was detrimental to London. But we are part of the working groups where we've been challenging to get onto all of the working groups. We're not on all of them. Mopac or the Met are being represented. Robin could probably come in on the one that you sit on.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm one of 4 MPCC reps taking 3 seats on the steering group for the review. So effectively, we myself and 3 other chief constables taking it in turns to represent policing. It is very much at the early days, the funding formula review. It is obviously the review is and the formula itself is complex. One of the critical questions we need to answer fairly early is, do we want a funding formula that fully reflects all of the unique costs of policing London, or does government accept that London is different? Which is where we are today, through the National International Capital City. But that's such a fundamental kind of opening question, because if we want a funding formula that really can capture the costs of policing in London, the costs of the serious and organised crime that kind of focuses on London, then we're going to need a much more dominant London voice in that debate, and it will be a much more complex funding formula than if it is just based, for example, heavily weighted on population or heavily weighted on particular crime data, because London is different. So that's a critical question that we are engaging with the Home Office and the funding formula team on, but it is too early to reach a conclusion.
Thanks for that. I think from my reading, and excuse my ignorance around this particular topic, I thought we were a bit further along than that. So what are the sort of timelines at the moment for the review?
The government set itself incredibly ambitious timelines, haven't they?
Yeah, they've moved a bit. So I think at the last steering group suggested that it would be proposals in early summer 2022. There is a period of time in February of next year. It's February for the activity analysis in a number of forces. So there's a complex piece of work planned in February to try and get an assessment of demand analysis across forces. But it's a complex piece of work. But it will be the middle of next year, I suspect.
Okay. My initial reaction makes me think that's a bit tight. When this has been done previously, what's happened previously? Has there been any drift or slippage with them?
Well, there have been two pieces of work previously by government in 2015 and 2018, was it 17, 18? But neither reached a conclusion for a number of reasons. The original proposal was to have recommendations in the spring, but I think now the independent chair of the technical review group, Professor Bland, has been appointed. His view is it's going to take longer, and I think he's right.
Okay, and I mean, there have been discussions around sort of crystal ball budget gazing in this morning, but are you getting a sense of any initial sort of things coming out of the review? Is there anything you could know?
It's far too early.
Okay, all right, that's accepted. So,
I think can I just say, I think it'd be really helpful if you, as the Budget and Performance Committee, wrote to the government about the funding formula review and the need for transparency and real clearness and clarity as to what is going to go into that, the indicators that are going to go into the formula review, because that's where it's always going to be the devil in the detail. That's where it's always been a problem, because it sort of goes into a black box sometimes in the previous reviews. It would be really helpful if you, as a Budget and Performance Committee, were able to help us challenge the government to make it as transparent and as accountable as possible, because that way I think London is a little bit more likely to get its fair share.
I think, I'm going to familiarise myself more with the terms and conditions as well, and I think if we're getting sort of feedback to the committee about how it's progressing, that would be, I think, useful as well, certainly to the committee, rather than sort of press statements or anything like that. But Robin, I just wanted a quick question about the McLeod judgment, which was the judgment around age discrimination in some of those pension plans. What are the additional costs as a result of that judgment for the pension scheme?
I'm going to ask Ian to, if I may, comment on the specific costs. I mean, the thing I'd say, just in advance of that, though, is, I mean, the government's, we are co-defendants with government on this, but the government have agreed to pick up the costs of separately from this settlement for the first tranche of cases. We are continuing to push governments to confirm that they will meet the full costs of all outstanding claims and the full costs of the move to effectively bring back the earlier pension scheme, put everyone back in the earlier pension scheme, and before everybody is then moved to new pension schemes in 2020. But the costs overall are, I mean, a number of billions of pounds. Yeah, I think a couple of £1 billion for policing, is it? I think overall, and for the public sector, obviously, it is huge. But at the moment, we are working on the assumption, although we've logged it as a risk, but working on the assumption that Government Home Office will pick up those costs separately.
Okay, so from my understanding, they've agreed to the first tranche,
They have.
but after that, there's no agreement on where that's going to be picked up.
I mean, litigation is continuing. As 3 tranches of litigation. We think it's optimistic. Government have agreed to pick up the cost for the first tranche, but we continue to work closely with government on it.
I mean, how many members are affected, would you say, roughly?
How many police officers? Very substantial. Thousands are affected in various different ways by these changes, and of course, everybody most people affected in some way, and it's causing a lot of, if I may, in a non-financial way, it's causing a lot of anxiety to officers in trying to understand, what this will mean for them, and it's not clear, and we're unable to tell them at this stage.
Okay, I'm mindful of time, Chair, so I'll leave that there.
Okay, fine. Thank you. We're now coming on to the Mopac revenue budget. Assembly Member Russell, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, Sophie, what discussions have you had with the Mayor regarding the funding that Mopac and the Met needs in 22-23?
I have regular discussions with the Mayor about the budget. You will have seen from the budget that we've got some issues around some cliff edge funding for Mopac and our services. I'm having discussions with the Mayor at the moment. Again, it's dependent on the overall GLA budget, it's dependent on government grant, but those are discussions that we have and will continue to have until the final budget setting process in February.
Thank you. And do you expect to receive more one-off funding in 2022-23 than in 21-22, or do you think it's going to be less?
I think at the moment we don't know. Sorry, genuinely don't know.
And you don't have any kind of indication, any kind of feel for it?
So there's a number of variables, isn't there? It's the same variables as the overall budget, really. It's the variables around the GLA budget, council tax yield, council tax business rates. We don't know what that will be till January. As with every year I've been deputy mayor, there's been the issue of what the council tax yield is, whether it's more than expected. And we've been fortunate in the past where it has been more than expected. So there's been a surplus where the mayor has allocated it to Mopac and to the violence reduction unit. It is also dependent on various, it's dependent on pay, inflation, and all the other things. Amanda, I don't know if you want to.
There was. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that in the recent 27th October, we had the spending review. It was a relatively positive settlement in terms of additional funding for victim services and also the criminal justice system. So we know that, for example, there'll be about £185 million extra nationally every year for supporting victims of crime. That includes funding independent sexual abuse and domestic abuse advisors. That's funding that the MOJ has, and we are working with the MOJ and lobbying them to make sure that London gets its fair share. Other examples include additional funding for reducing crime and drug activity. So in particular, county lines, there's actually £42 million for new programmes in relation to reducing crime.
Is that for London, 42 million for London?
Nationally.
No, nationally.
So in terms of the variables that Sophie's describing, we don't yet know what those SR announcements mean specifically for Mopac and for London. So we are continuing to try and influence government departments to make sure we get our fair share in London.
There was a press release this morning about the sort of factors driving crime, and also talked about investing in support for 100,000 young Londoners. And I was just wondering, there's very little information in the press release about that funding, and what those 100,000 young Londoners, how they're going to be reached, what funding might relate to that. But I just wanted to check, well, A, do you have any idea about what money is going to be used to deliver for those 100,000 young people, and also whether those 100,000 young people are over or under 19, because obviously the adult education budget can be used for the over 19-year-olds, but not for the under 19-year-olds.
It's a combination of Young Londoners Fund and Violence Reduction Unit funding that puts that figure up to 100,000 young Londoners who are going to be helped next year. That's where that figure has come from. So what was your other question? It's gone up my head.
Sorry.
Age. I don't know the answer to that. That's right, it went out of my head.
Okay, so is that something you can come back on?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
I suspect it will be up to age 25 normally, because, but I can double check that, because normally it is up to 25 because it's young persons rather than. But anyway, I'll check.
Yeah, I think the adult education budget, it goes up to 25, but it doesn't go below 19.
Okay.
So the point is, it's the younger people, who the Violence Reduction Unit do a lot of work with, who can't benefit from that funding. So there needs to be another source of funding to tackle that cohort of young people who obviously could do benefiting from the great work of the Violence Reduction Unit. Question for Amana about the 3.7 million being drawn down from the reserves to continue funding commissioned services that would otherwise cease due to inconsistent funding, it says. Are you looking at a way to identify and manage the funding streams to limit the extent to which this is necessary?
Yes, we are. So we are. We review our commissioned activity regularly. We've identified a tranche of services that for which funding ends at the end of this financial year. So no funding beyond 31st of March 2022. We did a fairly forensic exercise going through every single programme and identifying those services which we thought would be absolutely unpalatable for us to discontinue, and identified about £2 million worth that we wanted to continue. Sophie has a very limited and one-off reserve which is unallocated, and my advice to her was to use £2 million to fund those services which are unpalatable to stop. There was then a separate group of services equating to about £1.7 million, largely in the area to prevent violence against women and girls and to support victims of war also. And those are the ones that Sophie alluded to earlier, are going to be bridged for a period of 6 months, because we're hoping that will give us enough time to continue conversations with the Mayor about potential sources of income from the GLA, so potential additional one-off pots of funding. But more importantly, we should know from government by then, we should know from the MOJ whether any of the funding that I outlined earlier from the SR will be diverted to London.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to share that list of those the services that it's completely unpalatable to lose the 2 million?
There's published decisions on it. These are
great.
decisions that have
Thank
been
you.
taken, so they're published.
Sorry, I
Sorry.
hadn't been across that much detail, but thank you very much. So my next question is for Sophie, which is about mayoral commitments, which is, how do you feel that the Mayor's election manifesto commitments have been reflected in this budget?
I think we've set out some of the ways in which it has been in the budget proposal that we've published. You know, there's from the Mayor's Action Plan to the Youth Endeavour, the Shared Endeavour Fund, to work on violence against women and girls as well. It has been reflected, and clearly we don't, you know, in terms of it comes back to, and it is a really frustrating process, this, isn't it? Because it comes back to so many unknowns, and it depends what. It will be about the scale of what we can do will depend on the funding that we get, either from, depending on what the overall GLA budget is, or, more importantly, because it's more substantial because of the funds that are available, what the government allocates to us from either the Ministry of Justice or the Home Office. The Ministry of Justice, mostly victim services, and then the Home Office around violence reduction, but also around violence against women and girls as well.
So just picking up on the brilliant work of the Violence Reduction Unit, and in particular, I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of the offensive weapon homicide review pilot that they're doing. But the manifesto promised this long-term public health approach to tackling violence would be continuing. Now, the budget assumes an annual 7 million in future years, but it isn't guaranteed. So have you got plans to protect the VRU from future budget cuts and any decrease sort of going forward from, say, 2023, and against any kind of tapering down of funding from the Home Office?
So you'll see from the budget, there's the allocations from the Mayor are consistent and continue on, the allocation, and also the allocations that we do from Mopac into the Violence Reduction Unit of over £1 million from the London Crime Prevention Fund. They are just assumed, and we will continue to do that for as long as we can. The £7 million is Home Office funding, and we will keep pushing and challenging to make sure that we get that £7 million, because I agree with you, the Violence Reduction Unit is making a difference. It's making a huge difference to young people's lives, and we need the funding to continue that.
Mm-hmm. And just one other final question, which is about the Young Londoners Fund, which is due to expire in the next financial year. What in particular can Mopac do to pick up some of the slack in those youth services, particularly around the kind of positive interventions like mentoring, diversion, programs like Divert, as well as the education and training? And obviously you've got the young adults, the 19 to 25-year-olds who can be catered for with the AEB budget, but the young people, the ones who are under 19, have you got access to money to keep those programs going for them?
This isn't so much a Mopac issue, this is a GLA issue around the Young Londoners Fund, and it's tapering out. The Mayor has been absolutely clear that in the recovery of London post-pandemic, well, not post, we're not post yet, are we? But the recovery of London coming out of COVID, young people are absolutely his focus on this. There is a new deal for young people, £13 million in the budget for next year. So this isn't Young Londoners Fund goes and then, is tapered out and then Mopac have to pick up any slack. There is absolute provision within the budgets and within the GLA and the Violence Reduction Unit for young Londoners to make sure that that focus continues.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to clarify and get your confirmation on this. So the additional expenditure that's in the budget on areas such as the 650 new officers in town centres and high streets, the £39 million for permanent Viper teams, which I understand are there to tackle gun crime, and also the new funding for predatory offender units to tackle violence against women and girls. Are these all linked to the mayoral manifesto?
The question, strategically, yes, of course they're linked because these are priorities, but as Robin explained earlier, these are, in terms of the Police and Crime Plan, the Mayor's Manifesto and the Met's business, not the manifesto, sorry, because that politicises the Met and I don't mean to do that. The Police and Crime Plan is very, very much strategically aligned to the business plan of the Metropolitan Police. The Commissioner then takes the operational decisions as to where to deploy those officers and where that is most needed within London. Robin?
Yeah, no. So the funding is for those officers is mostly within the police officer baseline and out the growth for the year two. Obviously, the Commissioner will keep those units for as long as she believes they're the right way of policing those kind of crime types. And whilst whilst the requirement is there, those units will be there. You know, whilst there is a requirement for a predatory offender unit and subject to other even more pressing priorities, we will keep it. But those units are currently critical to our certainly our short-term ambitions. So I expect them to stay. But they're very much commissioner operationally judged deployment decisions that are aligned to our strategy and aligned to the police and crime plan, rather than being dictated by the mayor, which of course would be wrong, and he doesn't seek to do.
Thank you. I do have some more questions on that, but we'll put them in writing because I'm mindful of the time. Thank you. So we're coming on to our last section now, which is capital programme and reserves, and that's going to be led by my colleague, Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sophie, how would you assess progress against the Met's Estates Transformation Programme, and how confident are you that you will meet the target level of income from this programme to fund capital expenditure?
The way that we assess it is that I chair a monthly meeting for the Investment Advisory Board, and the Transformation Directorate reports that monthly, but with a very sort of much bigger deep dive on a quarterly basis as to, you know, where progress is and what is happening. So I have monthly reports on the disposals, monthly reports on property, and monthly reports on procurement, and that's how the progress is tracked. And then, of course, and I'm sure Marna can outline how outside of the meetings, the real work happens between Mopac officers and Met officers in relation to oversight and scrutiny of that. How confident I am that the capital budget that's set out here and ability to meet it, it's always going to be a challenge. There's always going to be slippage, but that's not the same as underspend, because actually, you know, this is slippage. So, for example, the Met is involved in complicated and complex legal arguments around Perivale at the moment. That will happen. So at some point, Perivale will be solved. It's not been solved on the timetable we had hoped. It's taken much longer.
Okay. And would you agree that the government's choice to underfund capital grants forces local police services into the position of having to sell assets to fund capital projects, and that this is ultimately unsustainable?
I mean, when I look, I actually always query the figure that we get on for the capital grant from the government of £3 million a year, given that we're over a £300 million capital budget. It is incredibly difficult. Forces across the country have taken and continue to take the same really difficult decisions around their estate, around buildings, to protect their frontline officers, but not just to protect them, but to support them, because the capital budget's not just about buildings. It's about the digital forensics that we got asked about earlier. It's about IT. It's about the kit, the uniform. It's much more than just the buildings, and it's really, really difficult decisions. And you'll see in here that we are reliant on borrowing, which has an implication and impact on revenue, and that is a problem. And when you look forward, we're clearly going to have to make sure that we keep, you know, proper scrutiny and accountability around this, because there's a significant borrowing requirement in the years to come.
Thank you. And how confident are you that Mopac and the Met's, sorry, this is for Ian, how confident are you that Mopac and the Met's planned drawdown on reserves over the next 3 years will keep them on a financially sustainable footing?
Well, we're confident based on our assumptions at the moment. We started this financial year with over £550 million worth of reserves. It's sensible that we utilise and don't sit with that. So we're using that for sensible one-off things throughout the period. The only bit that supports the sort of the base budget is, as we've talked about before, the business rates reserve drawdown. So we've taken sensible and sort of prudent approaches to using reserves to cover things like the estates transformation, things like one-off expenditure associated with change, and it's our sort of prudent assessment of how we should use those over the next sort of 4 years or so.
Okay, thank you. And back to you, Sophie, my last question. The Mayor's budget guidance required all members of the GLA group to demonstrate how their plans will address inequalities. Will you be publishing an equality analysis to fulfil this duty, as the Fire Brigade have done?
I think within the budget proposal, we say that the individual decisions that flow from the budget will, of course, have equality impact assessments. It's something that we've discussed. Amanda, I don't know if you want to come in terms of how that will happen.
Absolutely, thank you. So as Sophie's mentioned, she's referred to some previous decisions in response to an earlier question. We have published decisions for every time we spend money effectively, and as part of that decisions process we go through a number of different checks. One of those checks is around equality's impact. So in particular, if there is a new programme of activity, and even if it's not new, even if it's continuation of funding, but just spending money in the course of the year, we complete the equality's impact assessment, so for individual programmes. We are also mindful that, of course, it's not just the legislative requirement, but the Mayor has got a very clear approach to EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, and the context of that now is around the London recovery activity as well. We know that he set up the London Recovery Board. There are a series of missions, of which there are 3 in particular that the Met and Mopac have signed up to. And the reason why this is relevant is because a lot of the London recovery work is around protecting communities disproportionately impacted by the impact of the pandemic. And so we've signed up to the LRB, supporting numerous bits of activity. And going forward, every one of those individual decisions now also requires Sophie to scrutinise both Mopac spend and Met spend in relation to how well they're achieving London Recovery Board missions.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I've only got a very quick couple of questions, and that's it. I know I always ask about this, but I do think that I'll ask one and then I'll bring you and then I'll come back. I know I'm always going on about the blue light sort of sharing of estates with the other services. I just think there's so much money to be saved with the blue light services, sharing estates, getting together. Any news on that, Robin?
Well, I mean, there is good collaboration amongst our estates colleagues across the GLA and with Blue Light. We are we got collaborations into Purley with the London Fire Brigade and such like. We do have different needs, some of the different estate requirements and such like. And as you know, our strategy is very much to ensure that we are spending the right amount on estates, not more than we need to. But that means that we are going to be tight and such like. So the ability for people to collaborate and co-locate in our buildings is limited. But where we can find joint accommodation, of course, we will continue to do so. But to date, despite good effort, it's not been a particularly fruitful search.
No, it's so disappointing. I've got other questions, but I'll bring in my colleagues first. They may well ask them. Assemblymember Pigeon first.
Thank you very much, Chair. Probably to Robin, maybe Sophie as well. When are we actually going to see your estate strategy? I don't think I heard that earlier. You have been asking about this for so long. When are we likely to see it? And are we likely to see in it proposals to reduce the estate further?
Yes, you will see proposals to reduce the estate further. It is with me now. It has come to me for clearance now, and I will clear it. Probably won't see it this side of Christmas, so if we can, we'll try to do it. We will try to do it as quickly as possible. It did come to me before, and I did challenge on some aspects of it, and it's gone back in terms of. For example, there's an issue about lockers and the size of lockers, about what impact that would have on the estate. It sounds like it has a huge impact on buildings, the size of the locker. So, and there's been a locker review that has been undertaken, and the results of that have come through, and that we now have assurance and confidence that it's not going to make a material impact on the estate review, on the estate strategy.
So if I may, just one
yes.
if I may. So we've got an estate strategy, and delighted with the work that we've been doing with Sophie and her team on this. And there is then a annual review of effectively the size of the estate. So we've set out what we think in the estate strategy. We set out what we think the size of the estate needs to be. Our very, very best assessment, set against all of the other competing requirements of needing to only spend what we can afford and such like. But that may change, and I think it is important that everybody is clear that we do a thorough review of assumed disposals every year, and to make sure that they are, nothing has changed that means that's going to adjust. So we can do our best on our crystal ball. And we do our best in respect of the kind of cost of the estate against the savings we need to make. But the strategy and any linked disposals over the next 3 years will be obviously kept under review where it's necessary to do so.
But you have to be very careful, because once you've sold something
Of course.
off, you don't
Of
get
course.
it back.
Of course.
And if talking earlier, your ambitions to grow the number of officers, that will have an impact on the estate. So when precisely, Sophie, do you think you'll have made that decision? Because there are communities in places like Wimbledon, like Chiswick, like Teddington, all over London, who have been campaigning to save their police station. They want to know what the future is. When do you think they will hear from you on that?
I can't give you a precise date on that. I've got it to look at. It's a busy time at the moment. But I think most of the communities all the communities in London know, and this is really important, that the Mayor's commitment and the Commissioner's commitment to one 24-hour police station per borough remains. There will be no changes to that. So the estate strategy is not about changing that. DWO's being within 20 minutes travel time to their wards remains. There's no changes to the commitment to that. We're not talking about police stations in the sense of there are two boroughs where there are issues about Merton being one and Barking Dagenham being the other, but we are not talking about front counters here. We're talking about buildings and ERPT, response where response vehicles are parked, and every year it's very transparent and open, and it has happened this year as well. There is a list of disposals for this year which gets sign off as a decision, and they get published. So there is, and that's the review that Robin's talking about. It's there is a document called the estate strategy that needs to be published. Accept that, and however, the principles of the estate strategy and looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of what we need continues, and that is very transparent. Every year there is a list of those disposals, and that's what's going to be reviewed every year.
Thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Look, the estate strategy and the lack of being able to plan long-term on capital is the real issue. The real issue is we need to get a better capital settlement from central government. It seems to me that the police and Mopac have done a great job over the many years of doing this, but it's not conducive to good tackling crime in some ways. There must be a time, I suppose the question I need to ask the MPS, there must be a time of when the state strategy disposals programme comes to, it just seems to me that it's not good long-term planning of some of the decisions we're having to take, and we're going to take some terrible decisions in the future if we don't sort out a proper capital programme. We just don't have it. But when does it matter? When does national government sit up that it becomes, not having a lack of a capital programme, that we're not tackling crime effectively? And that, I suppose, is a professional question around this. We can cox and box for as much as we can and do a bit of short-termism, but don't we need to have a bit more oomph behind, a bit more of a spending plan to be effective crime fighters? Can I just have some comments back from Sophie and the MPS?
Thanks, Len. I mean, the issue of capital budget is a long-running and difficult issue, and it does mean that you're always having this itch, and I've talked about it already around the borrowing requirement, the impact on revenue, and the need to sell. We talk about disposals, that is selling buildings in order for the capital receipt to go into the capital budget, but also to create some savings, which are revenue savings in the running of those buildings. So it is. I mean, the majority of this is about the capital budget, but it is also about the revenue budget. It's not just about capital. I don't know, Robin, if you want to say anything else.
We continue to talk to government. Obviously, you would expect we would like a bigger capital settlement. We wouldn't want that offset by a smaller revenue settlement. So just to be clear, and indeed, government officials would say to us, look, it's more flexible for you to get revenue funding, and then you can determine how to use it, as opposed to us giving you less revenue and more capital. Our position is we need the capital. We would like longer term and we need the revenue budget, and we want a longer term and would like a bigger capital budget. We've got a really ambitious and I think well thought through capital program. We're transforming the estate quite properly. We are investing in technology. But the investment in technology is only going to need to improve and increase over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, and none of us know at this stage really what that's going to look like. How we can invest in data analytics and such like in order to be better crime fighters. We're working at that, but it will require capital and revenue funding, and you will see in our long-term capital plan that we've got placeholders in there, but it will become increasingly difficult to fund.
Chair, I suppose it's a question to us. On our final submission, when we come to write up our findings, maybe we could devote a sizable bit about capital. It's not going to be solved overnight and isn't going to be solved by a motion from us. I think we need to have a sensible way forward as scrutineers back over to the MPS and Mopac and back into government to saying, actually, this is not sustainable. We can't carry on like this. It's not good for good planning. It's not good for sensible crime fighting, to be honest, in terms of what the challenges we face in the future. I'll leave that with you and maybe for further discussion outside the room of how that could be done.
Yes, very happy to have a chat with you about that, Len, as always. We've now come to the end of questions, although I have got quite a few that I haven't put, but I'm mindful of the time, so we will write to you with further questions. Just to say thank you all very much for coming to see us and for answering our questions. Committee, I would like to have a 10-minute comfort break now before we start on fires, so we'll start back here at 5 to 12, please. Thank you. we've been having trouble with this, including me not turning it on. So there we go. So we're resuming now, and I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests from the London Fire Brigade and the GLA. So we have Adrian Bloomfield, who's the Assistant Director of Finance for the London Fire Brigade, Andy Rowe, of course, our Commissioner, James Buttery, Interim Head of Financial Management at the London Fire Brigade, Enver Enver, Assistant Director, Group Finance and Performance from the GLA. Welcome, gentlemen. Right, okay, I'm starting the questions this morning. Andy, how confident are you that this budget will deliver on the Mayor's manifesto commitments?
I'm confident that this budget will enable us to deliver against those commitments in a balanced way.
Well, that's good and positive and very succinct. Thank you. With an emphasis on those commitments which are directly actionable by the London Fire Brigade, rather than those relating to lobbying, which of his commitments do you think will be the most challenging for you to deliver?
I think that the cost of ensuring that we meet environmental targets moving forward is challenging because we maintain a very extensive fleet and estate, and the cost moving beyond the budget period we're considering today is likely to be the most considerable challenge if we think about finance, but we are in advanced discussion with colleagues in the GLA about how we might continue to meet those targets.
Okay, and have you or the Mayor set timescales for the delivery of his pledges?
We have in relation to sustainability. We've talked concretely about how, for example, by expanding, for example, our cadet programme, we're supporting other parts of the Mayor's commitment around youth and having an impact on youth crime in a positive way, using our power as a uniformed service in London. So we've laid out to the Mayor directly recently, set against his mayoral commitments, the progress we would hope to make in support of those.
Okay, will I write and ask you to put that in writing as to...
Absolutely, and we'll be able to lay out key items of delivery and future delivery against those major commitments set out in the Mayor's plan.
Good, I'm glad you mentioned the cadets. I think they're fantastic, I really do. A massive asset to us all. I think, Adrian, you're answering questions on in place of Joe Moore, aren't you? Yes. So your budget submission indicates that there is a risk that the LFC will not continue to receive the same level of grants during the period of the medium-term financial strategy. What are the key risks and how are you managing them?
So the key risk around grant funding is...
Sorry, can I ask you to move nearer to these? These are being very problematic today. Thank you. If you just go nearer it, it's not quite the same as City Hall.
So in terms of the risks around funding, so that's working with colleagues in the GLA in terms of the funding that will be available to the Mayor, but also working with the fire sector. So as part of the work with the fire sector, we'll look at our submission into the spending review to make sure that the challenges facing the fire sector are understood and they can be addressed as part of the consideration of future funding. But then also working with colleagues at the GLA, looking at the various drivers and movable elements on the funding available to the Mayor, and again making sure that they're understanding the pressures on the fire service, and that's all part of the consideration of that funding that's available.
Okay, can I ask you to put your microphone much nearer you so that's it, that hopefully that will work. What would you say is the biggest risk?
At the moment, I think there's significant uncertainty in terms of the impact of the pandemic and how that will impact on future funding. So that goes across the funding. I guess then in terms of some of the specifics, pensions, as I think has been discussed at this committee previously, is a challenge. So we're seeing that both in terms of the previous pension challenges we've had following the 2016 valuation, which we're now expecting to be concluded, but now with emerging challenges around the pensions remedy. So some of the figures that we're discussing are significant there. So there'll be financial challenges around that. And again, those conversations continue with the fire sector and with the Home Office in terms of funding arrangements for that going forward.
Yeah, we've been talking about some of those with the police, of course, who are suffering the same way. Andy, how confident are you that additional budget pressures from staff pay awards will be funded by the government?
Are we talking about that in relation to pensions or future firefighter pay?
Pay, we're just talking about pay awards.
I think that's an ongoing challenge. I think the discussions I'm having at national level reflect also the emerging risk in London in the built environment. So one of the challenges that Adrian didn't mention is the fact that I think we need to see a stronger baselining of direct funding from government around fire safety being maintained, because I believe we will be going back to look at buildings, for example, between 11 metres and 18 metres for risk.
Yeah.
We've already done
I think
all
we're
8,500.
coming on to, we're coming on. If we could just stick with the staff pay awards at the moment.
Well, I would suggest that that's something we continue to discuss with central government. I'm confident that central government has a view on how national firefighter pay will be managed going forward. I think we will see that expressed in the imminent white paper on reform. And I look forward to working with government to progress those matters. But I think we have to wait for the white paper, because I think it's going to address it directly, both in matters of funding and the structures surrounding pay nationally.
Okay, good, because that'll give us more certainty, which is a good thing. What contingencies are in place, though, if the government funding does not materialise? And what would be the potential impact on the budget?
I think the answer is that there isn't a contingency for that, because quite simply, government does have to fund that. It's a matter of national pay, just as it's a matter of national pension funding, and that the sums involved for the London Fire Brigade would mean, if that was unfunded and misunderstood in terms of its responsibilities by central government, that it would clearly present a very real challenge to our budget and therefore our ability to deliver our operational service into London. I'm confident in the discussions I've had with colleagues in the Home Office that they do understand this, but I would urge them to progress that clarity in both areas with some urgency.
Okay, well, I'm really pleased you've got confidence in that, because that gives us more confidence in what you're projecting. But one of the assumptions in the draft budget on page 27 is that all posts have pay progression. Can you just explain what that looks like in reality? For example, do you have pay scales with spinal points that people move up over time, or do people just jump between grades?
We on the support service side, have incremental pay scales for staff. So yes, staff can move up over time, but in a limited way, not in perhaps the same way as you see in some of the other services in London. Staff can jump between grades, but that has to be done on the basis of promotion and selection. It's not an automatic right. And for firefighters, we do not have an incremental pay system in that way. We're actually the only emergency service in London that doesn't. So the pressure is not felt in that way there. So it's fairly easy to predict.
Okay, well, that makes life easier in that way, doesn't it? Good, thank you. What representations are you making to the government about additional budget pressures facing the London Fire Brigade as a result of the pensions remedy? And I think this is probably for you, isn't it, Adrian? Or
Yes, it is, because we're making those representations formally at every level and informally in meetings. So, for example, Adrian will have sat in meetings with Treasury officials and Home Office officials to discuss the detail of this. I've discussed it directly with the Permanent Secretary, the Minister, and I've written formally on more than one occasion now to explain to colleagues in the Home Office that if we do not get the clarity we need in London, particularly as a service around pension detriment, we are facing an unbudgeted financial pressure that at the top end is estimated potentially to be around £100 million and could fall, because of the complexity of pension calculation, anywhere between that and some figure somewhat less, but very significant whatever figure we arrive at.
I know it's complex. I sat on the pensions board for the Fire Brigade at one point. It was challenging just being on that. It was an interesting committee to be on. Is there any risk, do you think, that the pensioners won't get the money that they're owed?
No, because firstly, we have a legal duty as a result of the court case that showed that the previous pension decisions taken by central government were in fact not legal. So we actually have a duty as a fire and rescue service to pay that money to pensioners correctly. And beyond that, I believe we have a moral duty to good public servants who many of whom would have spent 30 years in the service of London to do the right thing. So as far as I'm concerned, we must pay, we will pay. The difficulty for London is that unlike smaller services, we simply cannot pay because of the scale of the financial risk until we have clear guidance from government and a mechanism to do so properly.
Okay. What is the rough timescale you're anticipating with regard to the implementation of the remedy of this?
I can't provide you with that because I await the guidance from central government. All I can do is explain that clearly to central government that we can't proceed as the largest whole-time service with approximately 25% of national whole-time employees in the London Fire Brigade without them providing that guidance, and we will be writing to them again soon to chase up on what progress is being made to provide that guidance. They have advised us not to pay at this point because if we do, as some other services are, the financial risk lies with us. I do not believe that is a responsible thing to do in London, therefore, and our responsibility is to drive change and serve this city to start making those payments until we get that guidance. Obviously, that is wholly unacceptable for pensioners who are on the other end of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And your confidence, I'm sure, if they are watching, will give them great heart. So that's good. Even though if the government pays 80% of the costs associated with the remedy, how will the additional costs be borne by the London Fire Brigade budget?
Again, we have been speaking to government about the cost of implementing detriment. I think there's an understanding that because at the end of the day this was a government decision that was challenged in court, that there is a responsibility within central government to support us in the context of administration as well. It's not clear yet how far that will extend. I don't know whether there's anything you want to add, Adrian, because you've had more detailed meetings, but again, we continue to negotiate on that matter.
Yeah, and I think it's complex and to a certain extent confusing in terms of there's multiple elements to the challenge. So I think there's, as I touched on, there's still the final conclusion in terms of the pensions funding for the changes in the valuation in 2016. So that's where we've seen the 85% funding of the pressures so far, and it's making sure that's built into the base budget. And then in terms of the pensions remedy because of the unlawful transitional protection, there's the challenge at the moment is in terms of the plan to implement the remedy is over a number of years. So there is a plan in terms of changing the legislation, updating pensions administration systems, working with individual members to provide statements that provides the benefits under their current scheme and their legacy scheme, and then for members to make decisions. But that's all very, very drawn out. As just saying it sounds drawn out, let alone the months and years that will pass. So that's when we're narrowing conversations around immediate detriment in terms of is it fair that the individual members have to wait that long to get the remedy, but that's when it creates these financial challenges because the whole system of funding is geared up to work with the pensions administration system paying benefits in line with the pensions regulations. So that's where there'll be those ongoing challenges around can we implement immediate detriment, and as the Commissioner has set out, that's a very real funding pressure for us in terms of that cash flow and managing those additional costs until the formal remedy comes in place.
Well, it's something we'll definitely be keeping an eye on, so thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yeah, just the sections on financial assumptions. So just looking through the budget, you've got a 7 million departmental growth, which seems to be some sort of one-off in the year 22-23. Can you explain what that's made up of, please, so I can understand it?
Yes, I'm going to let Adrian give you the breakdown, but in simple terms, I think that exemplifies in many ways the cost of change. So much of what is being proposed there is about the work that needs to be done to the London Fire Brigade under the skin to ensure that we're a modern organisation that, manages projects properly, that delivers on time without slippage and within budget, that we have HR systems and the right skills, professionalism and capability in place to support a decent culture and improvements to leadership, and that actually we continue to fulfil our obligations to, for example, colleagues who've suffered medically in the past, or to fulfil our obligations in regard legal duties in regard to the Grenfell Tower inquiry. I'm going to let Adrian give the detail of the breakdown, but in simple terms, I found myself in January 2020 facing 66 recommendations arising from two statutory processes, the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the subsequent HMIC FRS inspection report. We could not disagree with any one of those recommendations. They all need doing, from the strategic and overarching to the very tightly focused and operational, for example, changes to high-rise firefighting. To achieve that, we have to evolve the London Fire Brigade. That is what that set of growth proposals is about. So, Adrian, if you want to give the breakdown now.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the £7 million, so as part of our budget process, we'll work with each department in terms of their budget submission, which will ask for details of savings against the savings target, but also then provide an opportunity to include growth proposals. So they will then be considered as part of the scrutiny process chaired by the Commissioner. So then in Appendix 4 of our budget submission, we then broke that £7 million down across the key departments in where those growth items are, and certainly in terms of the key elements of growth. So in terms of taking forward the organisation in the next stage of the transformation, as the Commission has just outlined. So there's £1.5 million as part of the Transformation Directorate. So that's looking at particularly around taking forward project management, working with the Project Management Office, so that we're doing those in a much more effective and efficient way to make sure they're delivered right first time. So that funding actually, that can be afforded within transformation funding that we've already set aside as part of previous budgets. There's also, as part of that transformation within people services that the Commissioner mentioned, so there's £1.2 million there. So that's getting people services ready for managing the service in a different way, and that line managers are better supported in terms of those their line management responsibilities. Excuse me. And then also some more ongoing challenges. So there's additional funding in ICT in terms of development. So what we saw in the scrutiny meetings was that there was a number of savings within ICT in terms of as items where there have been funding streams in the past that were coming to an end, and identifying new challenges going forward. So some of that growth is offset by some of those savings, but certainly again preparing for new ways of working and how we take the organisation forward. And then the final sort of key area in terms of that budget pressure and growth item was in general counsel. So that's looking at challenges that we've experienced over the last few years in terms of meeting compensation costs. So that would be for particularly injuries and meeting the cost of those. As I say, that we've seen those going up over the last few years, but also then in terms of...
Just repeat, you said general counsel, perhaps you can give me and compensation costs. Could you explain that more, please?
Yes, sorry. Within general counsel, so there's two key items there. So firstly, in terms of compensation costs, so we've been seeing, so these are in some cases historical cases where we've been seeing upward pressure in terms of settlement. So in some cases that's slight volumes, but in most cases it's the value of individual settlements. And then second element is in relation to legal costs on the Grenfell investigation.
And just what is the total cost for Grenfell legal in your budget?
So I don't have that figure to hand, but also, and part of the challenge with the Grenfell legal costs is a lot of those are met through insurance, so it won't necessarily be the total costs that fall to us. So substantial costs are incurred, but then recovered through insurance.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going on to saving proposals now, and that's going to be started by my colleague, Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Commissioner, as the Chair said, just turning to saving proposals across the 22, 23, 24, 25 budget period. Can you just tell us about the progress you're making on developing those proposals, And how is that going to help to fill that budget deficit that's forecast 23-24?
Yeah, so obviously through our planning so far, we've balanced the budget in the year going ahead. We anticipate balancing the budget with a small surplus the year beyond 23-24, but clearly there is an £8.8 million anticipated deficit in 23-24. So our intention is that the new target operating model, which underpins our statutory plan for London, the community risk management plan, so that's the instrument by which we deliver our legal kind of responsibilities under the Fire and Rescue Services Act to London and Londoners, that plan should deliver the vast majority of those efficiencies if the investment we're making in the financial year coming around planning, assessment of risk, better project management, understanding where efficiencies lie, is successful. If we're not able to meet all of those savings through that planning process, and we will need to bring those plans forward for consultation to the relevant committees, then we would make use of the budget flexibility reserve, and anticipating the uncertainty in the macroeconomic environment, we had set aside, I think it's 5.3 million additional into that budget flexibility reserve, recognising the pressures. So we would continue to present a balanced budget by judicious use of that, which is, of course, also in line with a national ask from the Minister and the Inspectorate to make proper planned use of reserves where appropriate, recognising this committee's challenge, which we think is valid, to do that as a last resort and drive efficiency from your organisation in the first instance.
Thank you for mentioning that. I was actually going to come on to the sustainability of using that reserve. But
it can be used in the medium term, and we have planned for that, but longer term, either through a combination of better consolidated and similar, having just heard the answers to policing, greater certainty around both grant, perhaps a devolved use of business rates in London to support fire, that we get a clearer planning kind of framework moving ahead around our finance, because that's not sustainable forever. We recognise that. Whilst we're going to be using it in the medium term to ensure we have a balanced budget, the way we meet the future challenge around our financial environment is through good planning in the CRMP and a more appropriate use of project management and kind of analysis skills, a better and more clearly articulated offer from central government over a longer term than this revolving one-year settlement, which has not been useful, and we look forward to some clarity in the three-year settlement. And we think that's the way we will move beyond that use of budget flexibility reserve in the future.
When you're talking about the framework and the sort of principle for looking at some of these savings, and you talked about the new value for money efficiency principles and how that's going to change that approach, can you tell us a little bit more about that framework and how it was put together?
Yes, so we've started with a principle document which is around value for money, which points to the sort of areas we might look at in transformation to drive out efficiency. And that really cuts across everything from how we do business and governance, so making sure the organisation's joined up. If you were to listen to the Grenfell Tower inquiry recently, you'll have heard significant kind of evidence and criticism that we just didn't plan in a joined up way, and that led to inefficiency, siloed working, duplication of effort, for example. We're very hierarchical. It may mean that we in some places need to have a flatter structure so that decision makers are closer to those who implement. And there needs to be a recognition around collaboration. I heard with interest the Chair's comments around use of estate. We have 103 fire stations. Actually, because of our response model, whilst you can talk about individual locations, the size of that is unlikely to change to manage and maintain the 6 and 8 minute response. Therefore, although the footprint on those fire stations is sometimes relatively small, we should be making better use of them in partnership with other agencies, particularly where there's synergy, like health. The COVID has shown that with the ambulance service. And actually with communities as well. These are spaces that are for the public good and should be more open for the public good. We know we're not there yet. So those would be examples of the sort of efficiencies and value we would seek to drive out through the target operating model and the community risk management plan. And I think the efficiencies lie in those areas where we don't make best use of systems, processes and decision making.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And when you have those sorts of systemic changes to an organisation, it takes a while to bed it in. You know, cultures develop over time, and changing those cultures takes time too. So what are you doing to measure that change and to make sure it's working?
Well, I think really you can only judge it in the outcomes we give to communities, really, and that's not a trite answer, because actually, again, if I go back to the inquiry and my experiences last week in the inquiry, I think sometimes we've been very inward looking in terms of our decision making and how we analysed our performance. Whereas really, we just got to judge whether or not it really delivers any change out there. So, you know, if we manage to train all our firefighters to respond entirely differently to high rise, then the investment we've made in better planning and delivery and containing that cost within the boundaries of our budget shows we're doing better, and Londoners are getting a better result. If we think about actually opening up our fire stations and perhaps having an ambulance on many more of them than we do now, that will, and we get a return of revenue potentially, and we are in advanced discussions with the London Ambulance Service about our estate strategy and their estate strategy, maybe that will mean I can demonstrate there is an outcome for Londoners. I think we've got to start at the other end, out in communities, to judge whether what we're doing is worthwhile. And I think that will be about evolving a more mature understanding about what performance means for the London Fire Brigade. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we could tell you entirely articulately at this point what good performance really means to us. We're getting there, but it's evolving. And I think we just need to be honest about that. I think we're developing those performance measures along the way. And I think one final point, if it's okay, Chair, I appreciate it's a long answer, is that what we have recognised is that we needed to bring in the skills, professionalism and capabilities from outside who've done this elsewhere to help inform that. So we have people who've come in from other industries who have got a track record of both delivering that change but also measuring it effectively, and they're bringing some of those skills to bear.
Thank you. And as I said before, I really do appreciate the challenge for an organisation like yours. And I mean, even though I'm not necessarily endorsing this, things we're seeing elsewhere in the GLA family, things like HR payroll, you know, moving to TfL to be run as well. Are you going that deep in your consideration of all the processes within the LFB?
Yes, I think we have to, because what I'm clear about is that the risk in London isn't shrinking. You know, if you look again what's coming out of the inquiry, you would recognise that we're looking at a national scandal in the built environment, where you know, we are going to be managing that for years to come. That is a greater level of productivity required from my workforce to meet that risk. The threat of terrorism is heightened, not lessened. We have absolutely got to deliver a different model of counter-terror response. So therefore, if we recognise we've got to maintain both the standard and size of resourcing in the front line, we have to be imaginative and drive efficiencies out of every other part of the business, because it's the front end that makes the difference to Londoners, well supported by efficient and proportional support services sitting behind that. So we absolutely are looking in the sort of detail around, can there be shared services in respect to payroll and all those other kind of individual process and system issues.
Thanks very much. And I really do appreciate the honesty and openness of the answer as well. And it'd be good to see the progress. Adrian, just turning to you very quickly. Looking at the budget, a lot of those savings are proposed to come from residential income, etc. How confident are you that you can achieve the rental income that, I think you said it against 1.4 million savings target, is that right? I haven't got my bins on.
Yes, so we continue to work with property colleagues to understand and make sure we reflect the current expectations. Yeah, I mean the market is developing and evolving in the post-pandemic period, so we are seeing challenges in terms of rental income and as I say, that market moving. So that's something that we will continue to monitor. And I guess in line with all the savings that are in our budget proposals, and we will continue to review those as we move from budget submission to the final budget that we'll approve in March. And I think just in terms of thinking about the efficiencies is going forwards, I mean, and it is important that we will review all of our savings proposals over the 3 years of the planning cycle at the moment. Once we've got the community risk management plan and the new target operating model in place, because being in a position of the final year of an old plan puts us in a quite a different place in terms of doing that forward planning than when we're in the first year of a new multi-year plan.
I'm pleased to say the London Assembly is doing its bit because of the delay to the Crystal, so I'm aware that we're also talking to landlords at the moment as well. Any further delay on that Crystal, will that have any impacts on the building here or that income?
I mean, I think the fact that we're here today, sitting in London Fire Brigade headquarters, probably speaks to the fact that we recognise we had some latent capacity and space in the building, and we put it to best use to, the benefit of London and Londoners, and that will carry on. We will continue to support the Greater London Authority in making that space available and making best use of our own resources.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
I think we'd rather stay here than go to the Crystal. Let's move on now to Assembly Member Sahota.
Yeah. Adrian, just come back to the question which Assembly Member Fortune was talking about. This £1.5 million saving is shown as a one-off saving. If it didn't have any adverse effect on your performance, could it become a permanent saving?
In terms of the rent?
Yes, in terms of rent.
Yes, so the intention would be that would be an ongoing saving. So we'll see it making the step change in the one financial year, but then consolidated into the base budget. So yeah, the expectation it will be ongoing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. How do you anticipate making savings from what is described in the budget as proposed savings to be delivered following the implementation of the People's Service Strategy? So how do you make this savings, and how confident are you that the £1 million savings can be delivered?
I think it's fair to say that savings target is aspirational at the moment. So as part of putting in the new arrangements in place to support the People Services Department, it was recognised that should allow savings as we move from the old arrangements to the new arrangements, to those old arrangements to be unwound and therefore there to be savings. However, the work will need to be done in terms of as we roll out the new way of working to identify then what can release out of existing capacity to then deliver those savings. So yeah, at the moment, early indications, aspirational, but we'll continue to work on that as we go forward.
So the £1 million is merely aspirational?
Can I just answer?
Yes.
It may well be aspirational, but I expect it to happen. I don't think you can make that level of investment on behalf of Londoners without demanding a return on it. So I've sent a very clear message to heads of service that I expect them to realise savings directly related to those investments. I don't think it's responsible, for example, to invest millions of pounds into project management, improvements in how we plan and deliver portfolio without recognising that you need an outcome from that. I have set a very clear expectation that if we set that level of investment in this financial year, I need to see a return, both in the context of efficiency, but also increases in productivity and our service out into communities. Because otherwise, I would struggle to justify it, particularly in a post-Grenfell, what is effectively an inspected environment now. I need to demonstrate that if I make that level of financial commitment, London and Londoners are getting a return. So yes, it is aspirational. Yes, it will be challenging for my colleagues, but I do expect it to happen. And I would expect this committee to hold me to account as well.
And I'm sure the committee will hold you to account.
Yes, absolutely.
But supposing that you didn't make those savings, what will the consequences be on your planning, on your budget?
Again, we would have to work with that in the context of it not having happened, and there would invariably be a consequence. But I think I really wouldn't get tied up too much in the phrase aspirational, because from my point of view, it's aspirational based on a good understanding of our own organisation. We can see where if we deliver what we've planned, there is efficiencies to be made. And it's about how quickly we can bring forward the benefits of that investment to then make those efficiencies. So those efficiencies aren't a finger in the air or a guess. They're set against existing structures, processes, and capabilities.
Okay, thank you. And finally, you've been benefiting from the recruitment fees delivering some savings to you.
Yeah.
At what point do you think this may lead to a drop in your performance levels, in your operational performance levels?
I think we're at that tipping point now. So I would anticipate us commencing recruitment in the new year. We're getting good support from colleagues in the Greater London Authority in order to progress that, because what we've done really over the course of the pandemic, recognising the very great financial uncertainty in that environment, was to make a prudent decision, and it was always a temporary measure, to freeze recruitment to achieve, I think it was £14.7 million worth of savings in the financial year we're in. But we never intended it to last forever. You can't do that and maintain the level of operational service we need to. We estimate we're at the beginnings of the tipping point where we need to start it up again, and we're working with colleagues in the GLA to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner.
Andy, the savings targets being aspirational is really what worries me, because this is a draft budget. You've just said that you had a good understanding of your organisation, which I believe you do. But if you've got such a good understanding of it, and you demand that these savings are made, why have we not got more detail on where these will be within this draft budget? Because it is, I mean, when I saw this, the one thing that shrieked out at me more than anything was the lack of information around the savings.
So if we talk about that 1 million as an example, there will be sensitivities about how we proceed with that, and we will need to plan that appropriately in the context of our legal duties as an organisation, and how we identify and then communicate those savings. But just to be clear, the use of the word aspiration is perhaps not one I would have taken, because I am clear that I think there are efficiencies to be made in the organisation, and we will do so on the basis of the investment we're making. Part of the investment will give us both the competency and capability to plan those in detail, but we can see because the investment we're bringing in is balanced where we think the savings are going to be achieved.
Okay, but I for sure would have liked to have seen far more meat on the bone on this, and this worries me considerably. On Savings 5, which is on page 49, it's for just under 300k, and that's in 24-25. And it's essentially an ask of the London Fire Brigade contractors to come forward with any ideas of saving money. The explanation states, and I'm quoting, "The figures are a target with no current detail to back them up." Do you think that's an appropriate or achievable saving to actually include in a budget submission?
I think in the scale of what we procure and our existing contracts, yes, because that's based on a historical approach to working with contractors to drive down cost. So many of the contracts we have savings targets within them, and we work continuously with contractors in what is sometimes evolving fields. So, for example, the cost of technology invariably starts to come down. Sometimes we identify partnership opportunities where we can leverage in our contracts with other fire and rescue services or other partners. So we think we've been fairly judicious with that because of the scale of the contracts we hold. And I would expect us to meet that. But that is an evolving picture. I think it's reasonable to make that projection because history tells us that contracts shift and the outcomes they deliver shift with it, whether we look at training or fleet or even our approach to property, which has evolved very considerably over the past 2 years.
Okay, but experience also tells us that when we're looking at savings without any meat on the bone, if you like, it doesn't give confidence that they will be met. We'll write to you about that, and if you can write back to us, even if it's in confidence about where you're looking, if there's a sensitivity to it, I do understand that. But I'm very concerned about this budget, and I would just like to see a lot more. But we'll move on now to the growth proposals, and that's going to be led by my Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. obviously I haven't got the deputy mayor here because she's unwell, and who is sort of covering her work while she's off? Who is kind of asking you the difficult questions on a day-to-day basis?
So a mixture of colleagues who work for the Deputy Mayor within the fire team, and also David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff. I have regular contact with him. I've spoken to David probably 4 or 5 times this week on different matters. So
gosh, that's
it's been quite a busy week coming out of the back end of the Grenfell inquiry and with some of the challenges of the pandemic. So yes, we have very regular contact with David, and he does indeed ask the searching questions.
I'm sure. No, I just for my mind, just wanted to get that, and also we would wish Fiona to get well soon. Obviously, you're managing this whole process, but if you take a step back, what's your honest assessment on the progress you're making to deliver your transformation delivery plan and the HMI's recommendations, which clearly a lot of your budget is around in terms of growth?
I would say the same thing to this committee that I've said to the inspectorate, that I said and spoken to public record at the inquiry, which is we are making good progress against that combined total of 66 recommendations. So if we take the GTI recommendations, so the Grenfell Town Inquiry recommendations, there were 29 relating either directly to us, 15 of them relating directly to us, 14 that included other emergency services and the National Fire and Rescue services. We have completed 23 of those as we sit here today. Another 3, so that takes us to 26, will be completed by the end of December. And then there's 3 longer-term projects that extend beyond 21, 22 because of their complexity and scale. And I can give you some of the detail on that. So, for example, if I go to recommendation, bear with me, 7, around storing electronic building plans and making them available for responding to incidents. We have an interim position. We've greatly improved the operational risk database. We've inspected 8,500 high-rises in London, and we have, plans for all of those in place. We need a consolidated database for London. That will take years to bring into operation. We're talking maybe 3 years because it doesn't exist, and we're drawing information from data sources beyond the boundaries of the London Fire Brigade. So that is a long-term IT project that will take time to deliver. That's one of the outstanding 3. If we talk about the procurement of new breathing apparatus and radio communications, because we took a sensible decision not to run those in isolation when the 2 bits of kit need to be integrated, we're looking at new breathing apparatus to be starting to be delivered in 2022 and radios before that. So I think we're making good progress against those specific recommendations. But what I am alive to is that after the Lacanau House fire in 2009, there was a similar action plan in the London Fire Brigade, where people made absolute best endeavour to meet a long, complex and detailed action plan. From my perspective, having heard some very disturbing evidence in the inquiry, what we then failed to do as an organisation is sustain that change. So I think it is one thing to say that you have completed actions on a plan in the moment. It is another thing entirely to sustain that change generationally. And my view is that the London Fire Brigade, in the face of those 66 recommendations arising from those 2 statutory processes, is beginning to make fundamental change to almost every area of the business, but still has a long way to go. And it will take time to bring that change, particularly in areas of culture and leadership, where things will need to be embedded. And I don't ask for people's trust in that. I expect you to judge us on our outcomes, just as I expect the public to.
Yeah, we'll come on to those in a little while with one of my colleagues. But you're right, this is more than just ticking off the list. We've done that, few through that onto the next thing. This is fundamentally about this whole organisation that you run, that you lead. And clearly colleagues who sit on the fire committee will get into that detail a lot more. But you've got additional funding going in to transform your organisation. What are we going to get in this next year? What's the outcome at the end of this year to show that you are turning the Titanic round and making those changes? What are your expected outcomes?
The difference is that we've already made. So if we're thinking about the what rather than kind of the why and the how, well, actually, I would like to start with the why. you know, I've got a personal interest in this. I stood in front of the Grenfell Tower for 10 hours and watched the bodies of men, women and children come out of it. It is the single most significant failure of the state of which we are part in the modern era. A tower block in London where people should have been safe, failing to such a degree that 72 people lost their lives. I will hold the images from that night in my head forever. And we owe it, in particular, to dedicated firefighters to bring this change as much as we owe it to London and obviously the bereaved and survivors. Actually, there were people that night who did unbelievably courageous things who deserved the change. So I hold this responsibility personally as a result of what I witnessed. What have we done? Well, we have trained, despite the challenges of the pandemic, every single firefighter to respond differently to high-rise fires. We have seen that at New Providence Wharf. We have seen the early evacuation of buildings where the stay put strategy was no longer, you know, sufficient. The very real operational challenges of training people to that, and despite that, we've done it. Actually, we've gone back to a place we should never have gone away from. 20 years ago, when I joined as a firefighter, I used to carry out fire safety visits. We used to give people advice, and actually station officers used to issue enforcement letters. We have now trained all 5,000 firefighters to do that. Once again, that's something that hasn't happened in 20 years, and we will visit thousands of premises, but it will take time to build that confidence and knowledge back to where they can do the lowest level of enforcement. But that's a massive change. That's real for Londoners. If I think about our own people and supporting our own people, you know, the inquiry, and I'm sure this committee would have watched parts of it, would have seen the point at which Mr. Millett just showed me some disturbing examples of where our culture isn't right. And actually, to address those sort of issues, we have commissioned an independent review of our culture led by Nazir Afzal, which I think will pose some very difficult questions, but that is real, that is happening, and I think our workforce will see the benefit of it. And we have commissioned, and it is budgeted for, and it has begun to deliver. We are delivering the largest face-to-face leadership programme in the history of the London Fire Brigade. Why is that important? Because actually it's your leadership that impacts your decision-making at the point you find yourself something at Grenfell. So the communities will experience the benefit of that if we get it right. So I think we're doing tangible things. People sitting in rooms of people, either training them or developing them, and then our people taking that learning forward out onto the streets of London. That's what the investment's about.
Yes, it is absolutely about changing that front line, but which is absolutely your comfort zone, but it's also that organisational sort of the behind the scenes bit. And you said you want to get the resource out there into the front line. So just to understand, looking at the budget, you're forecast to draw 1.1 million more than budgeted for from your earmarked reserves on this transformation delivery plan. Are you confident that's enough in this year? And is there a risk that in the next 2 years that you're going to require similar in-year increases?
I think we've planned appropriately, and we're looking at the investment at this point, and I think we're judicious in that. You know, we have unpicked, the London Fire Brigade in detail, as you might imagine, facing that level of statutory scrutiny over the past 2 years. And you're absolutely right about making sure we change things under the skin that, frankly, firefighters will never see and will probably never appreciate. So I'll give you an example. When I came in post in January 2020, I could not have told you rationally what our corporate risks were because we did not have an appropriate risk management system. We were still reporting to the relevant scrutiny committees, which is inexcusable that we were meeting our own performance targets at a point where inspection was telling us that as an organisation we required total improvement, and the inquiry being equally critical. We have an entirely different risk management framework that is embedded at every level now, and I have about 8 really significant corporate risks, ranging from finance to culture to the built environment, that you know might present an obstacle to delivering that change. That's proof of something changed under the skin. One of the most significant pieces of evidence I read into the inquiry was that we are still in the process of really trying to get a grip of assurance. You know, I did not have an organisational business assurance framework when I took over, which is frankly extraordinary to say, but I did not. We do have that now based on the Treasury best practice model of 3 lines of defence. We have an independent audit committee that hold me to account before I come into public scrutiny committees, so we know ourselves where things aren't perhaps working well before we come and present ourselves transparently to committees like this. I have an independent operational assurance advisor whose task is to crawl all over the organisation and again find those areas of concern so that we can deal with them and transparently present them into scrutiny. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, we've made investment over the past 2 years to really start to understand our organisation, and actually much of the past 2 years has been bringing about change that the front line will never see but needed to be done just to put in place the building blocks to then deliver the training, the development, the evolution of our culture, leadership. But I in no way think the job is done, and I recognise that the investment will need to continue to be made. If I think about an area of investment that I think we have yet to understand, and I will seek support from both central government and colleagues in the Greater London Authority, and we will potentially have to make efficiencies in other places, is around training. I would like to see firefighters trained in a far better realistic simulated environment in the form of an urban firefighting course, for example, week-long residential. That will cost. We've built some understanding of those costs into the budget going forward, but until we commission the work, we really get into that procurement process, we won't fully know. So inevitably, like all large organisations, the cost of change and the budget to support it will evolve. I think the difference from perhaps where we were in the past, recognising the macroeconomic climate, is that we can't take for granted we're going to get the money. So therefore, we have to challenge ourselves really hard as to what are our priorities, in particular look to shared services, collaboration, driving value out of every other part of the organisation. And again, in respect to this committee, the Inspectorate will absolutely demand us of that. We are in a different place from where we were in, say, 2018, when we could come to committees and present just a story of ourselves rather than really be examined by people on the ground.
Yeah. So the example you gave there of additional cost of this potential training course, I can see is a potential cost that you can't predict at the moment. Are there any other concrete examples you could provide about potential cost pressures associated with this transformation plan?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to one at the start of the committee around sustainability. And around making sure that we do our bit to meet the Mayor's commitment around the environment. You know, that commitment is real. But, for example, the cost of putting in an infrastructure so we can get to a zero-emission fleet of fire engines is very considerable. It's up in the kind of 100 million mark based on current technology. If we were to put it in across all our stations, that's the charging technology. Now, we think that cost's likely to come down, but we will need to negotiate with colleagues across kind of all parts of government to ensure that if we really want to meet those targets, we get the inwards investment we need. And we are, of course, starting to think about that in a concrete way. So that's another cost that might emerge.
Okay, and I don't know who's best to answer this. I'll ask it and you can decide between you. You state in your growth proposals the additional investment in people services for the year will achieve £1 million of savings over the years 23-24 to 24-25. Can you explain to us where and how these savings will be achieved?
I think if possible, I'd like to write to the Chair to provide that information. So the growth is represented really by the bringing in of skills and capability that we haven't developed to this point within the London Fire Brigade. So we're bringing in basically a business partner model, which will mean that actually, rather than perhaps a slightly old-fashioned approach to some of our HR support systems, particularly to managers out in the fire station estate, we bring in people who are taking a kind of whole view of how you best support our people, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is individual advisors who are very, knowledgeable, but are focused perhaps purely on discipline and grievance, purely on well-being, purely on payroll and support systems, transactional. We think we need to bring in a better level of support and guidance in a modern way to senior leaders in particular in the organisations. That's what that's focused on. I think that will then show what areas we can make efficiencies in regard to legacy systems and approaches. But if at all possible, I would like to write to the Chair on that matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll be pleased to accept that. I'm just going to mention a couple of points that you've brought up, Commissioner. Just to say, I was a member of LFEEB, which was, of course, the scrutiny board beforehand, and I'm absolutely mortified that we were given incorrect information on that, as indeed would have been our Deputy Mayor for Fire, because she was on Elfibra at the same time as I was. No doubt we'll come back to that. I'd also like to comment that I'm thrilled to bits that you are looking at proper real fire training, because fires have reduced so dramatically in the last 10 years that new recruits just simply don't get the same practice, if you like, on the job. And I think it's absolutely vital that they're put in real situations when they're practicing, as opposed to when they're actually having to deal with it. So I'm really happy to hear that. I'm now going to hand over for further questioning to my colleague, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to circle back to these environmental pressures, which is presumably making sure your fleet is ULEZ compliant. I actually raised this on LFIPA either in 2016 or in early 2017 as something that the Fire Brigade should be making preparations for. So it's really disappointing to hear that the preparations are as...
We are ULEZ compliant, just to be clear. Our fleet is ULEZ compliant. What we're talking about is looking to move to a zero emission fleet, which is challenging because that technology does not exist in the market. We've had to work with, we went through an advanced procurement process for a research vehicle, which is now complete, and we will launch at some point in the future. But that's the first credible zero emission pumping appliance on the market, certainly in the UK, but probably internationally, because of the challenge of providing a battery sourced pump. It's less, there's clearly electric HGVs out there, but it's the ability to sustain pumping operations over hours that makes that challenging. So we're not talking about whether we're ULEZ compliant. We are. We understand our obligations there, and we've done it. It's more the looking to the future and recognising that if we want to achieve what are rightfully challenging targets around emissions and sustainability, we really need to get ahead of the curve rather than just waiting for the market to give us the solution. We need to drive that change.
Great, that's very reassuring, thank you. I mean, it's not reassuring in terms of the cost and the scale of that, but sorry, I'd misinterpreted
the way I presented clearly.
what you said. So coming back to my actual questions, I've got a question for Adrian, I think. How are you addressing the impact of your vacancy rate in the LFC on the delivery of its services? I understand there's 157 vacancies and also 84 agency staff.
Yeah, so excuse me. So that's on the fire and rescue side staff as opposed to operational staff. So yeah, we're experiencing a number of challenges in terms of recruitment and retention of staff. So some of that will be, in particular, we're seeing challenges on fire safety in terms of the staff there, and particularly the skills in that area are very much in demand, and we're finding that there's the market is expanding as well. So as quick as we can grow, we can grow our talent. It's being attracted elsewhere. Excuse me. And then also in terms of other areas, particularly around professional services, we're seeing that there's challenges in terms of recruitment and retention. And part of that is working with colleagues in people services, and as part of the change in the way that we're going forward with people services is to look at the whole offering around FRS staff, both in terms of making sure that we've got the right training in place. The Commissioner alluded to some of that, but also in terms of looking at the way that we recruit people, in terms of where do we go to recruit those staff, and also perhaps over the longer term looking at the whole remuneration package and how we might do that slightly differently. And certainly within finance we've had some particular challenges, and that's part of what we're working with SITFA, so the professional accountancy body in the local government sector, to look at what we might need to do differently in terms of structures and and just our package that we offer and how we can address that. Certainly in terms of, you mentioned agency staff, so we make use of agency staff to offset some of those FRS staff vacancies. We've seen the number of agency staff go down as we started this financial year with some of the additional recruitment controls we put in place last year because of financial challenges with the pandemic. We've also moved to a new supplier for temporary staff, so we saw a few hiccups as we were transitioning from the old arrangement to the new arrangement. But again, in the kind of pandemic and as people's employment choices are changing, interestingly, we're finding that the cost of agency staff is going up, and people are choosing perhaps temporary careers to permanent careers. So yeah, it's an evolving market that we see for particularly professional staff and in fire safety schools as well in terms of that employment market.
I understand in the NHS they're getting very involved in kind of training and training programs, sort of connecting up with the.
Could I perhaps answer that? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we've built our own academy. So if we want to talk about fire safety, we've taken exactly the NHS approaches. We can't rely on the open market to employ fire safety professionals. It's one of the other reasons why we've gone and trained 5,000 firefighters, because that's going to give us a baseline understanding from where we will recruit in the future. Not without its challenges. It's a very, very challenging market out there. The building safety regulator that's coming is also going to poach staff because it needs staff with the same skills. How we're addressing it, and we are the most successful fire and rescue service in the country at doing this, and we need to be, frankly, because of the scale of the risk in the built environment, is we're widening out our access to professional qualifications amongst our station-based staff. We've got just over 300 of them now on a level 3 accredited inspection course, which will mean they're the inspectors of the future. Within fire safety, we now run our own academy, which takes people in at a more junior level into the organisation, or transferred across from the uniform side, trains them up with a view to retain them. And that process is continuous, and we have closed down the vacancy margin from where we were in fire safety considerably. We could write to you to give you the figures, because I actually think in some ways, in the context of the challenges of the market, it's a success story. At one point, we were down to about 30 vacancies, which is not ideal, but in the context of the hundreds of inspecting officers we have and need, is pretty good from where we started, and this is continuous. So I think we should write to provide you more detail, but you're completely right. That's the approach we must take. We have to grow our skills in-house as much as rely on the open market, because frankly, it's not out there in the open market.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the chair will be grateful to receive that written response. So, Andy, sort of one more question for you, which is about the financial implications of your culture review and the implementation of its recommendations. What are the financial implications of this?
Well, I genuinely think we've costed in what are likely to be the financial impact of this, because we've already got a very, very significant leadership programme going ahead, which is budgeted in. What I would suggest is that the learning from the review will be built into that, because how you treat each other, how you behave, is implicit within the leadership programme. We have a separate programme of cultural awareness workshops and conversations being rolled out. That, again, is budgeted in, and what I would expect is what goes into that and our approach to it to evolve, because what I don't think we can do is wait for the cultural review to deliver its results. We know ourselves many of the things we need to improve in our culture. I think it's right to bring in someone entirely independent to sense check that and to really exemplify it very clearly to the whole organisation, and to explore aspects we might not have considered. But in terms of the mechanisms to actually deliver change, I think they're there. Mm-hmm. It's the detail that goes into them as much as anything. Mm-hmm. And obviously we've budgeted for the review itself, and we have a clear cost framework around that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Could I just pick up on that around the culture, because obviously it's notoriously difficult to change culture. You've got, how are you going to measure success? Because our committee's budget and performance, how are you going to measure that to show that that investment has been successful?
I think there's all sorts of places where you can measure it. You can measure it in the volume of discipline and grievance cases as a starting point. You can measure it in terms of the balance of demographics within those processes. So at the moment, we know, and I've stated it to different committees before, that if you're a black firefighter, you are more likely to get disciplined by some percentage, I would expect to see that reduce if we work with, issues of unconscious bias and discriminatory process and system. We know that you are less likely to get promoted as a woman. Again, I would expect to see that shift. So I think there's some very obvious data-driven examples, but I also think it's about really good people survey, that, the qualitative evidence, going out and asking our workforce whether they feel different, whether it's been of value, what their relationships are like in the workforce. I think there's soft signifiers like sickness, what sort of absence we have in the organisation. Sickness related to anxiety and stress is still one of the highest reasons for people going off work in the London Fire Brigade. Perhaps we might see some of that reduce. So I think there's lots of different ways we might measure it, and people are thinking actively about a suite of kind of performance indicators that will tell us whether we're having an impact. And I think actually, to go back to what is always my starting point, I think we need to ask communities whether they're seeing a difference, because I think when we change our culture, we will see a difference in our openness and relationship with communities as well, and we should be going out and asking them.
Thank you. Our sickness figures have always been bad, though, haven't they, Commissioner? So we'll go back to that another time. Just to ask a couple more questions of Adrian, if I may. When will you know the final position of your 0.5 million growth proposal for corporate services, and when will the review be concluded?
A key element of that is a review within finance. So we're working with CIPFA on that review. That review is due to provide preliminary findings by the end of this month. In terms of the wider corporate services piece, that work will continue as we work to appoint the new Director of Corporate Services.
Okay, and which corporate service functions form part of this review? Because the draft budget just said a number. That was on page 12.
I think you've got to turn it on, Adrian. Apologies.
So the initial conversations were with Joe Moore as the interim director of corporate services, and in terms of that broader focus, the primary focus was within finance, but also recognising some of the challenges that we've mentioned earlier in terms of staffing. So to look at potentially across procurement, where there's a new assistant director for procurement, but also potentially the wider elements of corporate services.
Okay. I remember we've always looked at procurement and been concerned there, so that'll be an interesting one. Andy, will the £5.4 million training proposal to upskill the LFC staff on counter-terrorism preparedness be delivered in 22-23?
I think it has to be, because the threat is real, not existential. I think we've got an obligation to both Londoners and firefighters to do so. So yes, it is my anticipation that we will press ahead with that.
Okay, and if you start having issues, will you flag them to us? Because I agree with you. I think they should.
We will, but my message to all parties involved in this, both the Home Office, government, the unions, is that we're going to do this because it's right for London and Londoners. And, and there are varying views on aspects of this, but from my point of view, from the experts that we speak to in both the Metropolitan Police and security services, this is the right approach, given the sort of totality of coverage that London needs because of the nature of the threat. So I am clear that within the time period laid out, we need to get to a point where every fire engine in London has the right PPE on it, with properly trained firefighters to respond in the same attendance times to a terrorist incident as they currently provide for fires, in a way that is understood and properly prepared for.
Yeah, good, because that does give us comfort. And what's the anticipated additional pressure on the budget for that in subsequent years?
I think that the additional funding that the Mayor gave us this year is what we're using to fund the acquisition training and then the cost of it rolling forward. And my understanding of that has been built into the baseline budget moving forward. It has. It's good. Included, yeah.
Okay, Adrian's nodding. That's
good.
Good to hear. It's always good, isn't it? And how does this cost compare with other fire services where similar training has been agreed and rolled out?
They haven't agreed similar training and rolled it out. So I would suggest that the London Fire Brigade and Manchester Fire and Rescue Service will be the first fire and rescue services in the country to provide that totality of cover, and that London is leading the way in that.
Okay, and it compares cost-wise favourably to Manchester then, does it?
Yes, because I think we will probably embark on a similar model.
Okay. And how will you ensure you achieve value for money in the way the money is spent on that additional training?
I think, again, it will be demonstrated in how, I'm afraid, we respond to the incidents to which it relates. At the moment, I'm in a position where, whilst we have good specialist teams who provide the specialist counter-terror response, I think every London firefighter should be trained to that level, because what I've seen in London is firefighters who did not have the right level of preparation put themselves into harm's way, for example, on Westminster Bridge.
Yeah.
And I would expect London firefighters to continue to respond that way. I do not think you will see in London what perhaps was seen in Manchester and is emerging from the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry, because we have repeated examples of London firefighters responding with great bravery to terror incidents without always having the right PPE
Absolutely.
or equipment.
Yeah.
But the threat in London is different from almost anywhere else in the UK, and I think it is right that every London firefighter is trained to the kind of level of what is currently seen as the National Fire Service's specialist response, and we'll be the first brigade in the country to do that.
Good. Okay. I do have questions on that training because I'm more than
course.
interested in that. I'll put it in writing to you if I may.
Thank you, Chair.
For the sake of time. We come now to our last section, which is the capital programme and reserves, and that's taken my colleague, Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much. So looking at your capital programme, so looking at the current year, we've seen a huge underspend, 24.8 million less than budgeted for at the beginning of the year. I think slippage in fleet and estate transformation and so on. So how are you managing, for example, your estate transformation programme to minimise further slippage in the projects and these significant underspends?
I think generally we've taken a completely different approach under new leadership. So Laura Birnbaum has been in for a couple of years now as our new head of property. She's completely turned upside down really as part of transformation our approach to estate management. So I would like to say I think in general terms this is a success story. There was a point when I was Assistant Commissioner of Fire Stations where I could not go onto a fire station without the first thing being brought to my attention rightly by crews, the poor state of the fire station I was sitting in. I was asking them to deliver a professional service while they were sitting in buildings with windows that hadn't been fixed for 2 years. So much of what has happened has successfully addressed much of that, and I don't hear that in the same way when I go to fire stations. So I know the strategy's working in terms of improving what was an ageing and at times poorly maintained estate. The challenge obviously of flexing with what is a shifting capital position, I think I should turn to Adrian to talk about. But as a general principle, I think we are on top of this, and we have built sufficient flexibility into processes to work with what we've got available and prioritise those buildings in greatest need first.
Yeah, certainly what we've seen in the capital delivery of the capital programme is some of the challenges in relation to the pandemic. So in terms of staff being able to, or contractors being able to access sites to progress work, and then also on the fleet side in terms of some of the challenges around those pandemic staffing, but also in terms of movement of key parts in terms of vehicles across borders as those have changed. So I think part of the challenge has been anticipating how those challenges will start to ease, and I think we probably assumed at the start of the year, that particularly around the pandemic, that those things would ease, and then obviously with the extension of the pandemic they've continued to be in place. And some of the property ones where there's significant site redevelopments, you've seen that some of the tender responses came back at levels higher than we'd anticipated. So again, it's looking at why is that, and what do we need to do to revisit those. So again, that introduces a delay into the programme. In terms of that underspending, I think part of the challenge for the capital programme is that most of the capital items take a number of years to deliver. So it's less about that those capital programmes will cost less money. It's around the phasing. And so what we've seen is that the delivery are certainly key cost elements moving into later financial year.
Okay, so I understand why you've got some of this slippage, but what are you doing to try to manage it? Because clearly these are things you need to do.
Greater sight, and obviously you haven't got of the director here, because we're in a process of recruiting a new director for corporate services. So really, it's about having an estate strategy that allows flex, that allows kind of a different approach to managing property, for example, in particular. So taking a whole station approach, not doing works individually, going back round the round repeatedly, to consider where we're making improvements first, where we can actually wait longer and perhaps save money, recognising potential issues within the supply chain, because there are issues around that, around cost and availability of materials, changing the plan in relation to that if necessary. So there is planning being done pretty much all the time around prioritisation and planning of delivery. Obviously, there's a challenge around capital receipts, which means at some point we have to look at borrowing, which I would probably get Adrian to talk to more detail to. It may well be that we do have to look to a greater level of borrowing in the future to kind of manage progress. Would it be helpful for Adrian to speak to that?
Not at the moment. What I really want to understand is you've got this capital programme.
Yeah.
You're clearly reprofiling it because you're looking at how you do the work. But this year you've already seen some slippage.
Yeah.
What are you doing to pull that back? Or are you just saying actually that's part of this because we're rethinking how we do everything?
I think it's a mix of both. I think part of it's pulling back. So sensibly, in individual circumstances, we're looking at where we can reprioritise, where we might not actually carry out some work because it's sustainable not to. And I've got to go back to the target operating model and the community risk management plan. Obviously, as we look ahead, how we use our estate, particularly in collaboration with others, is equally important about how we kind of make best use of that and where there might be shared investment, for example. But I think we've got to explore those opportunities in greater depth. I mean, the fact that you're here today using this building shows us that when we apply some imagination, we can find a different way to use our estate, and there may well be opportunities we haven't yet identified within that. So I think the answer is we're taking an inquisitive approach to it. There is slippage. You have to accept there's an element of it in what is a very difficult macro kind of economic climate, and some disappointing kind of moments around anticipated capital receipts. So if you think of 8 Albert Embankment,
Well, that's what I'm just going to move on
I did wonder
to.
whether
Come
we
on,
get
8
to
Albert Embankment. Even when I was on FIPA, which feels like a lifetime ago, 8 Albert Embankment was on the table. What's the current situation with that?
Well, so obviously
site?
it's really disappointing that the developer lost the right to appeal the Secretary of State's decision. We're back to a place where I need a fire station there. It's vital to that bit of London, but we're considering all of our options, and we will have to develop the site and maintain what is a Grade 2 listed building, and make sure we've got a fire station there. So we're back to the drawing board on that. We're considering all options. That's been done in detail with all relevant stakeholders.
And what's the timescale for a new plan?
I think we've got to give both our advisors, the relevant stakeholders, the developers that were originally involved, the time to consider that. I would expect to see a more developed plan early in the new year as to what those options look like. And again, we've tried to challenge ourselves. We've gone outside of the walls of the London Fire Brigade to do that. So we've gone back into colleagues in the GLA and some of the other bodies. And again, we can write to the chair in terms of some of the conversations we've had with others around how we might approach this differently, looking at the experience of people like the Metropolitan Police in terms of divesting their estate, TfL, and perhaps learning some lessons from elsewhere. I mean, on the positive side, we of course have seen a much better result from the sale of Clerkenwell than we expected, which I think speaks to the leadership of Laura Birnbaum, who's our head of property, who actually stopped us doing what we were doing previously and took a completely different approach to the disposal of that part of our estate, and as a result achieved a much better than anticipated capital receipt. I think if we let her loose on 8 Albert Embankment, which we will now, because she's now no longer really burdened by what was almost 13 years of legacy decision making, we may well find we do better.
Okay, we look forward to seeing that. In terms of delivering your capital programme as a whole, you've already touched on some risks. You've talked about supply chain, but are there any other key risks that are worrying you about delivering it?
I think the two major ones are supply chain issues, particularly if you think so much of our capital receipt, our capital investment programme is focused on property, so much of it. Supply chain issues are the major one because they're being experienced by all organisations. The cost of building materials is huge. Access to professional contracting services in terms of doing the work is massive. And then the second one is one we've already just discussed, which is funding. So the capital receipts that have been available in recent years are coming to an end, and therefore that creates an increased reliance on borrowing. They would be the two major issues I would identify.
Yeah. Okay, and then I understand that also it's not really for this year's budget, but that borrowing cost is, as you say, a concern going forward. Can I just pick up the issue finally on reserves? And I don't know whether this is for you or Adrian. Just want to understand your thought process when you've decided to take 6.1 million from reserves in 2022-23, another 6.1 the year after, and then another 4.4 million, reducing your overall level of reserves. What's your thought process on that, and is it sustainable?
I think it goes back to a previous answer, which is no, not beyond the medium term. But we did it really because we thought it was good financial planning in the context of the uncertainty in the macroeconomic environment. We needed to build ourselves a buffer, recognising that there, like all the other public sector organisations in London, there was both real uncertainty and real pressures on us. And identifying an appropriate amount of money going into budget reserves to ensure we continue to balance the budget as required to seemed sensible.
And how does this compare to other fire authorities, fire, whatever you're called now, fire brigades across the country? How does it compare in terms of the level of reserve compared to budget? What does your auditor say on it?
I think that our auditors are fairly clear that it's an appropriate use of reserve. And actually, I think we're in a better position, I'm afraid, than some of my colleagues around the country, particularly in county brigades, where, for example, it appeared to me that they hadn't planned forward always necessarily for incoming pressures around unanticipated pay rise, for example, the potential issues around capital and supply chain. So actually, I think, to give due credit to my colleagues in the LFB who plan forward in front of, for finance, it was right to make use of the reserves in that way and plan to make use of the reserves in that way.
And you still have enough there, more than other places?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're in a good position compared to most other fire and rescue services. And I think what we're doing, whilst I absolutely respect the challenge from this organisation and the committee here, that we can't just rely on reserves. We don't think we can. It does also speak to the Minister's very direct intervention on this matter, which was he would like to see fire and rescue services across the country make better use of the reserves that were available to manage the uncertainty of finance during the pandemic. So we did listen to that and attempt to do our best.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions left. We'll write to you if we could have the answers to them. But I would like to thank our guests for attending and answering our questions. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Deputy Mayor for Fire, Fiona Twycross. She's done some incredible work around emergency planning regarding COVID, and we all really appreciate that. And of course, she's very poorly at the moment, and we wish her, I'm sure, all of us well. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Noted. Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 2021-22? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 17th of December 2021 at 10 a.m. in these committee rooms G0, 2, 3 and 4 at the London Fire Brigade headquarters. I have not been given notice of any other business, so I will close the meeting. Thank you.